Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This happened to me a few years back, and I've replayed it in my mind countless times since. The story begins during the late fall, with crisp air and golden leaves carpeting the streets. It was a Friday evening, one of those days when the grind of work had me craving some solitude. I had just finished my shift, thrown my messenger bag in the back seat, and was looking forward to a quiet weekend in the countryside. You see, I've always loved driving. Something about the hum of the engine and the rhythm of tires against the road gives me a sense of peace. That evening, I decided to head to a cabin I had rented a couple of times before, located a few hours away in the mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, rustic retreat with enough space to breathe. I often used it as my getaway spot, far from city noise and distractions. With my GPS mounted on the dashboard and a playlist of acoustic tracks queued up, I felt ready to leave the stress of the week behind. The car, an older but reliable sedan I'd driven for years, had never let me down. I had my thermos of coffee tucked in the cup holder, a jacket tossed on the passenger seat, and snacks in the glove compartment. The drive began like any other. Streetlights gave way to the occasional farmhouse and rows of cornfields as I ventured further from the city. There was something comforting about the monotony of the road ahead. Cars thinned out, leaving me alone with the landscape. It wasn't my first trip to the cabin, so I didn't even think twice about the route. A couple of hours in, I noticed the GPS suggested an alternate path. It wasn't the one I was familiar with, but it claimed to shave off 20 minutes from my drive. That sounded appealing. I'd get there sooner and have more time to unwind. The route led me off the main highway and onto a narrower, winding road. I'd always trusted the GPS to get me where I needed to go, so I followed its instructions without much hesitation. The road was quiet, eerily so. The further I drove, the fewer signs of life I encountered. The occasional mailbox or driveway faded away until there was nothing but tall trees on either side, their dark branches creating a canopy over the asphalt. It was peaceful at first, but there was a strange sense of isolation that started to settle over me. I tried to shake it off, turning up the music to drown out my unease. After all, it wasn't uncommon for these mountain roads to feel desolate. I convinced myself I'd seen the same on previous trips, winding routes where civilization seemed to vanish for a while before reappearing in the form of a gas station or diner. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the GPS directed me onto an even smaller road. This one was barely wide enough for 2 cars and didn't have any streetlights. It felt more like a trail than a proper road, with potholes and patches of gravel breaking up the pavement. I hesitated for a moment, but figured it would connect to a more familiar route soon enough. The first hour of driving had felt routine, but now there was an edge to the air. I noticed the temperature dropping more sharply than I'd expected, and the heater in the car didn't seem to make much of a difference. A fog began to roll in, swirling around the car in ghostly wisps. It made visibility tougher, forcing me to slow down. I glanced at the GPS again. The estimated time to my destination hadn't changed, which reassured me a little. But when I checked my phone, the signal bars were gone. No service. That was a first. I'd driven to this area before and never had issues with my cell reception. The first seeds of unease planted themselves in my mind, but I brushed them off. I reminded myself that I was probably overthinking it. The GPS knew where I was, and the car was running fine. No need to worry. Or so I thought. By the time I realized the road seemed to stretch on without end, it was too late to turn back. I hadn't passed a single intersection or side road for miles, and the GPS assured me I was on the right path. And that's when things started to feel wrong. The first unsettling sign crept in so subtly that it barely registered at the time. I was still on that narrow, deserted road, the GPS guiding me deeper into the woods. The fog had thickened to the point where the headlights struggled to pierce through it. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles whitening under the strain. The Jeep's voice chimed in, "Turn right in 300 feet." But when I looked ahead, I saw no road, just a dense wall of trees. I leaned forward, squinting to see if I had missed something. The road seemed to dead end right into the forest. I tapped the brakes and came to a stop. Pulling out my phone, I checked the map app. Still no service. The GPS, however, insisted there was a road ahead. "Turn right," it repeated, now sounding almost impatient, as if urging me to comply. A cold prickle crawled up my spine. There was no road. My heart thudded in my chest, but I reasoned with myself. Maybe the map was outdated, and the road had been overgrown or closed off. Either way, I had to make a decision. I threw the car into reverse, preparing to backtrack to the last turnoff. But as I shifted gears, the car shuddered. It wasn't the gentle jolt of an older vehicle adjusting, it was a violent tremor that rattled the entire frame. The engine sputtered, then died. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel as silence engulfed me. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind outside. My breath fogged the windshield as I exhaled shakily. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered briefly, then went dark. The car, my reliable companion for years, had betrayed me in the worst possible place. Panic bubbled up, but I forced it down. I wasn't the type to lose my head easily. I popped the hood and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam of light was weak, but it was enough to guide me as I stepped out into the cold, damp air. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no rustling animals, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I opened the hood, but as someone with minimal knowledge of cars, I had no idea what I was looking at. The flashlight flickered, its beam wavering like it was struggling to stay alive. Then it went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, shaking it and smacking it against my palm, but it refused to turn back on. Now, the panic was harder to suppress. I felt exposed, standing there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by towering trees and an impenetrable fog. My breath quickened as I stepped back toward the car. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a faint sound, so soft I almost missed it. It was like a whisper, but not words. More like the wind catching on something it shouldn't, a low, continuous hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. My eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Finally, I yanked the door open and climbed back into the car, locking the doors behind me. My heart was pounding now, each beat echoing in my ears. I tried the ignition again, desperate to hear the comforting rumble of the engine. Still nothing. Leaning back in the seat, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "It's just a breakdown," I whispered to myself. "Cars break down all the time. I'll wait it out until morning and flag someone down." But deep down, I knew there was something off. The way the car had just died, the flashlight failing, the eerie whispering sound, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked my phone again, even though I knew it was pointless. No service. The battery was draining faster than it should have, too, dropping by several percentage points in the few minutes since I'd last looked at it. I turned it off, deciding to conserve what little power I had left. I glanced at the GPS. The screen was still on, but the map had frozen. The little arrow representing my car blinked on and off, as though unsure of its own existence. Then the voice chimed in again, startling me. "Proceed straight ahead." My blood ran cold. There was no road ahead. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The voice repeated itself, louder this time. "Proceed straight ahead." I turned the GPS off, but the voice didn't stop. It echoed through the car, clear and unrelenting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, filling the cabin. I didn't know what to do. The thought of stepping out into the darkness again sent a wave of dread washing over me, but staying inside the car didn't feel any safer. For the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly trapped. And that's when I saw the shadow moving through the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me in the thick mist. But it was there, unmistakable. It wasn't shaped like an animal or a person. It was something else entirely, its movements unnaturally smooth as it glided through the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it. It stopped, hovering in place, as though it knew I was watching it. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, it started toward me. The shadow moved with an unsettling fluidity, its outline bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before, and my body's instinctive response was to stay absolutely still. My breath came in shallow bursts as I watched it draw closer, weaving through the fog as though it were a part of it. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a dark shape in the mist, but there was something undeniably purposeful about its movements. My mind raced with questions. What was it? Was it human? Was it even alive? As it neared, I became acutely aware of every sound or lack thereof around me. The forest had gone deathly quiet again. No wind, no rustling leaves. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my chest, so loud it seemed to echo in the stillness. Then, just as suddenly as it had started moving, the shadow stopped. It lingered about 20 feet from the car, its outline faint but undeniably there. I stared at it, unblinking, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Suddenly, the car lights flickered. The headlights sputtered weakly before plunging me into total darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for the flashlight in the glove compartment, even though I already knew it wasn't working. When the headlights came back on a moment later, the shadow was gone. My relief was short-lived. The GPS, which I had turned off minutes earlier, powered back on by itself. The screen glowed ominously in the dim cabin, and the mechanical voice returned, distorted and garbled. "Turn around," it said, the words barely intelligible through the static. I reached over and yanked the power cord out of the device, but it didn't turn off. The screen flickered, the little arrow spinning wildly as if caught in a vortex. The voice repeated itself, louder this time. "Turn around, turn around, turn around." My pulse pounded in my ears as I slammed my hand against the device, trying to silence it. The screen cracked under the force, and the voice cut out abruptly, leaving me in an almost unbearable silence once more. But the peace didn't last. A loud, metallic screech echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across metal, a sound that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. I whipped my head around, scanning the fog for the source of the noise, but I couldn't see anything. I didn't want to leave the car, but I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was out there to find me. My hands were trembling as I pulled the door handle and stepped out into the cold night. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog clung to my skin like a damp shroud. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response. I crept toward the front of the car, the flashlight still dead in my hand. The hood was still open, and as I leaned in to take another look, I noticed something strange. The engine was coated in a thin, black substance that hadn't been there earlier. It smelled acrid, like burning rubber mixed with something chemical and rotten. My stomach turned as I reached out to touch it, then thought better of it. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. The screeching sound came again, louder this time, and much closer. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The fog shifted, almost alive, as though something massive was moving through it. I backed up until I hit the side of the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who's there?" I shouted, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog, a voice answered. It wasn't a voice I recognized. and it wasn't speaking in any language I understood. The tone was low and guttural, almost a growl, and it sent chills racing down my spine. I scrambled back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled with the keys, trying the ignition again, but the car was still dead. I cursed under my breath, tears of frustration welling in my eyes. Then, the car's radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, broken by bursts of distorted voices. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something desperate and frantic about the tone. The static grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, until I reached over and yanked the radio knob. It didn't turn off. The noise only grew louder, a cacophony of sounds that seemed to reverberate inside my skull. I covered my ears, curling into myself as the sound reached an unbearable pitch. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I lifted my head cautiously, my ears ringing in the sudden silence. The fog outside seemed thicker now, almost suffocating. I could barely see past the hood of the car. That's when I noticed the handprints. They were on the outside of the windshield, smeared across the glass in a way that suggested they had been made recently. The prints were too large to be human, the fingers long and claw-like. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I stared at them, unable to look away. I reached up to wipe the glass from the inside, but of course, the prints were on the outside. The screeching sound came again, this time from directly behind the car. I whipped around, peering out the back window, but all I could see was the swirling fog. I grabbed my phone, flipping it on, even though I knew there was no service. The screen lit up, and for a brief moment, I felt a small surge of relief until I saw what was on the screen. It wasn't my home screen. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was a live feed of the forest, the view shifting as though it was being recorded by someone or something moving through the trees. And then the feed stopped. The screen went black, and bold white letters appeared, spelling out a single word. Run! My body reacted before my mind could process what I'd seen. I threw open the car door and bolted into the fog, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. The forest closed in around me, the trees looming like dark sentinels as I ran blindly, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. The screeching sound didn't let up, its shrill, grating tone burrowing into my brain as I pushed forward into the fog. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep going. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, an impenetrable labyrinth of dark shapes and swirling mist. My phone, which I still clutched in one hand, flickered back to life. The screen glowed faintly, but instead of a familiar interface, it showed a map, a distorted version of the GPS I had been following earlier. The map was crude, hand-drawn, with jagged lines and symbols I didn't recognize. A small, blinking dot marked my location, and a red arrow pointed toward what appeared to be an X in the distance. Beneath the map, bold text flashed repeatedly. "Stop running." I ignored it, shoving the phone into my pocket as I continued forward. The air around me felt heavier, almost viscous, as though the fog itself was trying to slow me down. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the cold, damp ground. As I scrambled to my feet, the screeching sound abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl came from somewhere behind me. It wasn't the kind of sound any animal should make, at least, not any animal I knew of. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground beneath me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. And there it was. The figure stepped out of the fog, its form distorted and unreal. It was tall, far taller than any person, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Its skin, or what I assumed was skin, was a mottled ashen gray, glistening as though wet. But it was the face that made my stomach drop. It didn't have a face, not in the traditional sense. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface. No eyes, no nose, No mouth, just an eerie, blank slate. Yet somehow I could feel it looking at me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed back onto the ground. My body refused to move, paralyzed by a primal, all-consuming fear. The creature tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement that felt unnervingly human. It took a step closer, the ground trembling beneath its weight. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my voice stolen by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. As it closed the distance between us, I noticed something even more horrifying. Its shadow didn't match its movements. While the creature stepped forward, its shadow twisted and writhed on the ground, shapes and symbols forming and dissolving in an endless, chaotic loop. The symbols were the same as those on the map, the ones I hadn't recognized. They glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the creature's movements. Desperate, I forced myself to move, dragging my body backward across the forest floor. The creature stopped, tilting its head again, as if curious. Then, it raised one elongated arm and pointed at me. The screeching sound returned, louder than ever, and this time it was accompanied by whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping and indistinct. "You don't belong," they hissed, the words intertwining with the screeching. I clutched my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. The sound was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The creature took another step closer, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Leave, leave, leave." I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know how." I screamed, my voice hoarse and broken. The creature paused, lowering its arm. For a moment, the whispers quieted, replaced by a low, almost melodic hum. The symbols on its shadow began to shift again, this time forming a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. A circle, jagged and imperfect, with a smaller, intricate design at its center. The creature stepped back, its movements slow and deliberate, and pointed at the ground in front of me. The symbol from its shadow appeared there, etched into the earth as though burned by an invisible flame. The humming grew louder, and the fog around me began to swirl, converging on the symbol. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had no choice. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the symbol, my entire body shaking with fear and exhaustion. As I reached the edge of the design, the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a cocoon. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the creature, standing motionless, its featureless face somehow exuding an air of finality. Then, there was nothing. No sound. No light. Just an all-encompassing void. I don't know how long I was there, seconds, minutes, hours. Time had no meaning in that place. When I finally came to, I was lying on the ground beside my car. The fog was gone, replaced by the soft, golden light of dawn. The car's engine purred softly, as though it had never stopped working. My phone lay on the passenger seat, its screen cracked but otherwise functional. I sat there for a long time, staring at the forest that now seemed so ordinary in the daylight. But I knew better. Whatever I had encountered that night, it wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, and I had no intention of ever going back. When the morning light bathed the forest in its warm glow, it should have brought a sense of relief. Instead, I sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the surrounding trees. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, and my body trembled with residual fear. The creature was gone, or at least, I hoped it was. But its presence lingered, etched into my mind like a scar that would never heal. My heart still raced, my breath shallow and uneven as I struggled to piece together what had just happened. The engine of my car idled smoothly, a cruel reminder of how powerless I'd been only hours ago. I hesitated to touch the gear shift, half expecting the car to rebel against me again. Slowly, I pressed my foot against the brake and shifted into drive. The car obeyed. As the vehicle rolled forward, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the creature's distorted form re-emerging from the forest. But the road behind me remained clear, save for the morning mist that seemed to dissipate with each passing second. I didn't stop driving, not even to check my phone or GPS. I didn't care where the road led as long as it took me far away from that place. Hours later, I finally pulled into a small gas station on the edge of a quiet town. It was one of those old, worn-down stations with faded signage and a cracked concrete lot. The attendant, an older man with weathered skin and a friendly but cautious expression, waved at me as I parked by the pumps. "You look like you've been through hell," he remarked, his voice carrying the kind of genuine concern that only came with age. I nodded but didn't reply. My throat felt raw, as if speaking would unleash a torrent of emotions I wasn't ready to confront. "Need anything besides gas?" he asked, tilting his head toward the small convenience store attached to the station. "Water," I croaked, my voice barely audible. He handed me a bottle from a cooler nearby, brushing off my attempt to pay for it. "You take care of yourself, son," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he could see the fear etched into my face. I mumbled a thank you and returned to my car, the cold water soothing my parched throat. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, trying to make sense of everything. What had I seen? What had I experienced? Was any of it real, or had my mind conjured the entire ordeal in some strange, sleep-deprived haze? I pulled out my phone, which had miraculously survived the night. The GPS app was back to its normal interface, displaying my current location without any ominous messages or distorted maps. I checked my photos and messages, searching for some proof of what had happened, but there was nothing. The only evidence that anything out of the ordinary had occurred was the strange symbol burned into my memory, the one etched into the ground in front of me before the fog consumed me. The next few days were a blur. I made it home, but the journey felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't shake. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of comfort and routine, felt foreign. The familiar walls and furniture did little to ease my unease. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was plagued by nightmares, visions of the faceless creature, the screeching sound, and the whispers that had invaded my mind. Each time I woke, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, I felt a crushing sense of dread. I tried to talk myself out of it. "It's over," I whispered to myself in the dark. "It's over, and it's never coming back." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. In the days that followed, I began researching the area where it had all happened. I scoured local forums, historical records, and obscure paranormal blogs for any mention of strange occurrences or unexplained phenomena in that forest. What I found only deepened my unease. Stories of missing hikers, inexplicable disappearances, and sightings of a shadowy figure dated back decades. Locals had their own names for it: the Watcher, the Faceless One, or simply it. Most accounts were vague, shrouded in the kind of ambiguity that made them easy to dismiss as urban legends. But there were enough similarities to my experience that I couldn't ignore them. The symbols, in particular, appeared in several accounts. People described seeing them carved into trees, etched into the ground, or even appearing on their skin like temporary tattoos. None of them could explain their meaning, and most who encountered them didn't live to share their stories. I realized I was one of the lucky ones, or perhaps unlucky, depending on how you looked at it. One night, as I sat in my living room surrounded by printouts and notes from my research, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a notification. "Unknown number." Against my better judgment, I answered. A low hum filled the line, followed by a voice that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the creature's voice, not exactly, but it carried the same unsettling tone. "You were warned," the voice said, its words slow and deliberate. "Stay away." The line went dead. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling as I backed away from it as though it might come alive. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on, to pretend that my life could return to normal. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what normal even meant anymore. The forest, the creature, the symbol, they were all a part of me now, seared into my memory like a brand. I sold the car, I couldn't bear to sit in it again, not after what had happened. Every time I saw it, I was transported back to that desolate road, to the fog and the fear that had consumed me. I avoided anything that reminded me of the incident, but it was impossible to escape completely. The whispers still haunted my dreams, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I swore I could hear that screeching sound in the distance. I don't know what it was that I encountered that night. A creature? A spirit? Something beyond human comprehension? And maybe I don't want to know. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Some roads are better left unexplored. Some places are meant to stay hidden. And some warnings should never be ignored. Months have passed since that night, but it feels like the shadows of the forest never truly let go. I sit here now, in the safety of my apartment, trying to piece together what remains of my life after that harrowing experience. Writing these words is both an act of catharsis and a warning, though I'm not sure who I'm trying to reach myself or anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. When I close my eyes, the memories flood back. The faceless creature, the screeching sound, the whispers that seem to claw at the edges of my sanity, they all remain as vivid as the moment they happened. Yet, despite everything, there's a strange sense of clarity now. I've replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. But the truth is, some things defy logic. What I experienced wasn't something that can be rationalized or explained. It exists outside the boundaries of what we consider normal, a dark corner of reality that we're not meant to understand. Life hasn't been the same since that night. The mundane routines that once grounded me now feel hollow. Every trip in the car, every glance at a map, fills me with a creeping unease. I've developed a habit of double-checking routes, avoiding anything that might take me near unfamiliar forests or desolate roads. My social life has dwindled. Friends have noticed my withdrawal, but what can I tell them? That I encountered a creature in the woods that erased my sense of reality? That I can't trust my own senses anymore? Even if I could find the words, I doubt they'd believe me. It's easier to let them think I'm just going through a rough patch. One night, I decided to take another look at the research I collected. The symbols, the stories, the fragmented accounts, they all pointed to something ancient, something that predates any written history of the area. It's as though the forest itself is alive, a sentient entity that chooses who it reveals itself to. What chills me the most is the thought that I might not have been the first or the last. The unknown number that called me weeks ago has remained silent since, but I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is watching. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, feels like a reminder that the forest isn't done with me yet. There's one moment that keeps coming back to me, one I've been too afraid to confront until now. After the fog lifted, as I drove away in that eerie silence, I saw something in the rearview mirror. It wasn't the creature, it was me. Or rather, it looked like me, but there was something off about it. The reflection stared back with an expression I didn't recognize, its eyes hollow and lifeless. I blinked, and it was gone. I've tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a fragment of my exhausted mind playing games with me. But deep down, I know better. That moment wasn't a hallucination, it was a message. So where does that leave me now? Living, but not truly alive. Existing, but always looking over my shoulder. The experience has left me scarred, not just mentally, but spiritually. It's as though part of me is still trapped on that road, wandering the fog, searching for answers I'll never find. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll heal. Maybe I'll find a way to move on. Or maybe the forest will call me back one day, and I'll have no choice but to answer. For now, I take solace in small victories, waking up to see the sunrise, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, hearing the laughter of strangers in the distance. They're fleeting reminders that there's still beauty in the world, even if it feels out of reach. To anyone listening, let this serve as a cautionary tale. The world is vast, and there are places that remain untouched for a reason. Curiosity can lead us to wondrous discoveries, but it can also lead us into the jaws of the unknown. If you ever find yourself on a road you don't recognize, with the GPS guiding you into the heart of nowhere, turn back. No destination is worth losing yourself literally or figuratively. The forest took something from me that night. What it was, I may never know. But I've made peace with one thing. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. And as I sit here, bathed in the warm glow of the lamplight, I find myself whispering the same phrase over and over again, like a mantra, like a prayer. Never again. With that, I'll leave you to ponder the story. If this has resonated with you, if it stirred something within, remember to share your thoughts. Perhaps your words can reach where mine cannot. Stay safe out there, my friends, and never stray too far from the light. It was a quiet, ordinary evening when I started my shift. The clock struck 11 o'clock, and the world outside seemed to fade into the distance. I had worked the night shift at the small convenience store in town for almost 2 years. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. It was the kind of place that people stopped by on their way home from late night shifts or after a night out. Sometimes I'd chat with a regular or two, but for the most part, it was just me, the shelves, and the endless buzzing of fluorescent lights. The store wasn't in the most well-lit part of town, but it was my job, and I wasn't one to complain about it. The dim lights outside barely illuminated the empty street, and most of the other businesses in the strip were closed by the time I came in. There was a small diner a few blocks down, but it rarely stayed open past midnight, leaving the store as the only active business in the area. I would often listen to the radio for background noise, scanning the aisles or checking the stock in the back room. It was a routine, a predictable one, but one that helped me keep my mind from wandering too far. I wasn't exactly thrilled to work the graveyard shift, but it was manageable. I had gotten used to the silence of the store after hours. The quiet hum of the refrigerators, the low buzz of the overhead lights, and the occasional car passing by on the street. These sounds had become my companions during the long hours of solitude. Tonight, however, something felt different. I couldn't explain it. There was a sense of unease creeping in, as though the silence was too thick, the air too still. It was nothing that I could put my finger on, but it was there, just on the edge of my awareness. The first few hours of my shift went by like any other night. I'd clean the counters, straighten the rows of chips and candy bars, and stock the cooler with drinks. A few customers came and went, their faces half hidden by the dim lights outside. One woman came in for a pack of gum, and a man grabbed a bottle of soda, exchanging small talk with me as they checked out. It was nothing new, nothing unusual. But then, around 2 o'clock, it happened. I was standing behind the counter when I noticed something strange. The lights flickered, a subtle stutter that was almost imperceptible. I hadn't thought much of it at first. Power surges weren't uncommon in the area. But as I stood there, I realized that the flickering wasn't just a random glitch. The lights didn't flicker and die. They flickered, then dimmed, then stayed dim for a few seconds before returning to normal. I frowned, pressing the palms of my hands on the counter and looking up at the ceiling. The buzzing from the fluorescent lights was more pronounced now, and I could hear a faint hum coming from the cooler behind me. It wasn't a sound that should have been there. It was deeper than the usual whir of the refrigeration system, almost as if something else was causing it. But I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves or the hour. Around the same time, I began hearing odd noises from the back room. At first, it was nothing more than a faint shuffle. I didn't think much of it. The store was located at the edge of town, so there were times when animals, stray cats or raccoons would wander into the back, knocking things over in search of food. But this wasn't the same. The noises weren't random. They were deliberate. like footsteps moving across the linoleum floor. I walked into the back room, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed louder than it should have. The room was empty. No animals, no mess, nothing. But as I stepped back into the main area, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a strange, prickling sensation crept down my spine. The lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just stutter, they completely dimmed, casting the entire store in a soft, eerie glow that made everything feel surreal. I wasn't the kind of person who was easily spooked, but there was something about the air tonight, something heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I tried to push it from my mind and went back to my usual tasks, but it wasn't long before I felt a presence. Someone was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just behind me. But each time, the aisle was empty. The shelves were silent. As the hours wore on, the feeling of unease grew. The store was empty. The only sound, the faint hum of the cooler and the occasional creak of the building settling. But there was something else, something deeper. The air was thick, charged with a kind of energy that made my skin crawl. By 3:30 a.m., the store was quieter than it had ever been. The only thing I could hear now was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I began to wonder if I had imagined everything, the flickering lights, the noises in the back room, the odd feeling of being watched. But then, just as I was starting to dismiss it all, I heard it again. This time, it was much clearer. A soft thud, followed by a scrape, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. It came from the back room, unmistakable and undeniable. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself frozen for a moment, staring at the doorway that led to the back. The noise continued for a few more seconds before it stopped abruptly. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to check. My feet moved before my mind could even process the decision. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and slowly made my way to the back room, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The door creaked again as I pushed it open, and for a moment, I just stood there, scanning the darkness. The back room was still empty, but there, on the floor, in the corner, was a long, dark streak like something had been dragged across the floor, leaving a trail behind it. My stomach churned. I stepped forward, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, and moved closer to the streak. But as I did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. It was sudden, too sudden to ignore. My breath became visible in the cold air, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end. I couldn't explain it, but something wasn't right. I had never felt so uneasy in the store before. Something had changed. Something was wrong. I wanted to run, to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. What could possibly be causing all this? What was in this store with me? I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The dragging noise, right behind me. I stood there, the cold air biting at my skin as I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I could still hear the faint scrape of something heavy being dragged behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned around, shining the flashlight across the dimly lit back room. There was no one there. I was starting to doubt my senses, but the feeling didn't go away. That uneasy pressure, like invisible eyes were studying my every movement, was still there. The dragging sound had stopped, but the air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. My legs, still frozen in place, finally started to obey me as I slowly backed out of the room. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't like the usual late-night noises. This felt different. I forced myself to leave the back room and walked back to the counter, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I stepped back into the main area of the store, I looked around, half expecting to see something or someone waiting for me in the shadows. The store was eerily still, and for a moment, I thought I was just being paranoid, that it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling lingered. a weight pressing down on my chest that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on the task at hand, stacking some cans on the shelf, but every few seconds, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye. I checked the clock again. It was nearly 4 o'clock. The store was still quiet. The only sounds the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional rustling of the air conditioning. But my mind was no longer at ease. Then it happened again. This time, it was much clearer. The lights above me flickered once more, but this time they didn't just flicker and return to normal. They flickered, then completely shut off for several seconds, plunging the entire store into darkness. A feeling of panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a display of snacks. My hand instinctively shot out to grab my flashlight from the counter. I clicked it on, but the beam trembled in my hand as I moved it across the room, searching for anything that could explain the sudden darkness. The lights flickered back on, and the store was lit once again, but something had changed. It wasn't just the lights, it was everything. The air felt colder, the hum of the refrigeration louder. And there, just beyond the beam of my flashlight, I saw a faint shadow, barely visible, but enough to make my stomach turn. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow was on the far side of the store, near the windows, where no one should have been. It wasn't a person, it wasn't shaped like one. It was just a dark patch against the already dim lighting. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the flickering lights had done something to my perception. But even as I convinced myself of that, my feet slowly moved toward the shadow, as if my body was reacting faster than my mind. I reached the spot where the shadow had been, but it was gone. The area was clear, the shelves lining the wall untouched. I stood there for a few moments, just trying to make sense of it all. What had I seen? Was it just a trick of the light? It had to be. It had to be. But even as I repeated this to myself, my heart continued to pound in my chest, and the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I walked back to the counter, trying to calm myself down. I was used to being alone in this store. I was used to the quiet. But tonight, it felt like the quiet was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a mistake. Waiting for me to slip up. My mind raced as I tried to shake off the anxiety that had gripped me. But the sensation lingered, like something was drawing closer. Then, a noise. A loud bang, like something heavy falling to the ground, came from the back room. My body tensed at the sound, and before I even realized what I was doing, I was rushing toward the door. My mind screamed at me to turn back, that it could be nothing, but my legs wouldn't listen. I had to check. I swung open the door to the back room, the harsh light from the flashlight sweeping across the floor. It was empty again. But there, lying in the center of the floor, was a box. A box that hadn't been there before. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. My first instinct was to tell myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe it had fallen from one of the shelves earlier, or maybe I had accidentally knocked it over and forgotten about it. But something about the way the box had fallen, the way it was positioned, felt off. It was as though it had been placed there, deliberately. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't anything special, just a cardboard box with a few products inside. But as I set it back on the shelf, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the room with me. Someone had placed it there, knowing I would come. I closed the door and stood for a moment in the quiet, trying to steady my breathing. I felt stupid. I knew I had to be overreacting. The store had always been empty at this time of night. No one came around except for the occasional customer, and they all left quickly. But tonight felt different. I returned to the counter, the unsettling feeling still hanging in the air. It was as if the store itself had transformed into something unfamiliar. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. The lights flickered again, but this time I barely flinched. The noise in the back room, the dragging sound, started again, faint at first, but unmistakable. My heartbeat quickened, and this time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried to the back. The dragging sound seemed to follow me, becoming louder with each step. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle, and when I threw it open, I felt my breath freeze in my chest. The back room was empty. No box, no strange shadow, but I couldn't explain the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there, flashlight in hand, searching the room for any signs of what had happened. I couldn't find anything, but the strange sense of dread continued to grow, pooling in my stomach like a weight I couldn't shake off. I stayed in the back room for a few moments longer, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. The silence was unbearable now, and the only sound I could hear was the rush of my own breathing. It felt like I was waiting for something to happen, but nothing came. There was no answer to the question that hung in the air. What was going on? Reluctantly, I returned to the front of the store, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I couldn't explain the shadows, the noises, the way the temperature had dropped. But I couldn't ignore them either. I glanced at the clock. 4:45 a.m. Only a little more time until my shift ended. But in the back of my mind, I knew I wouldn't feel comfortable until I was out of there. Just then, a customer entered. It was the first customer in what felt like hours. I barely acknowledged him as he walked up to the counter, the weight of everything still heavy on my shoulders. The man was wearing a dark coat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. I didn't know why, but the sight of him made my stomach tighten. He stepped up to the counter, and for a moment, he just stared at me. No words, just that strange, unreadable gaze. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The man didn't answer immediately. He just kept staring. It wasn't until he finally spoke that I realized how much my hands were trembling. "Have you seen it?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Seen what?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. But the man just nodded, as if he knew exactly what I was talking about. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the store. I stood there for a long moment, not knowing what to make of the encounter. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. Something was very wrong in this place. Something I wasn't ready to understand yet. The nights seemed to grow longer as the days passed, each shift blending into the next. At first, I thought it was just my imagination tricks my mind was playing on me after spending so many late hours alone in the store. But the events were no longer subtle. They were becoming harder to ignore. The shadows felt thicker. The cold air that seeped through the walls had a biting edge. The lights flickered more frequently now, as if the very building was haunted by some unseen presence. Every small noise felt amplified, sharp, and unsettling. I had begun to lose track of the time. It was nearing 3:30 a.m. when the third incident occurred. The store had been eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound seem amplified, like a drip of water echoing off the walls, the faint hum of the refrigerators, and the occasional crackle of the overhead speakers. I was organizing some inventory near the back of the store when I heard it, a muffled thud coming from behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a customer or a colleague walking through, but the store was empty. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. The air had grown colder, and the faint sound of rustling seemed to echo from the dark corners of the room. I crept cautiously toward the sound, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My flashlight's beam flickered in my hand, as if it too was anxious to reveal something. In the far corner of the store, near the stockroom door, I saw a small object, a bottle of cleaning solution, lying on the floor. It had not been there before. The room was otherwise still, the shelves untouched. My heart raced as I crouched to pick it up, examining it closely. There was no sign of any disturbance, but the unease was creeping in again, tightening around my chest. I could feel the air growing heavier, as if something was watching, waiting. Then came the sound, the unmistakable drag of something across the floor. It was closer now, right behind me. I turned sharply, flashing the beam of the flashlight across the store. But again, there was nothing but the silence and the unsettling feeling that I was not alone. I started to walk toward the back of the store, my steps tentative. The dragging sound stopped when I reached the door, but the sensation of being watched was still there, thick and suffocating. I entered the back room once more, my flashlight illuminating the dark space. It was cold here too, unnaturally so. My breath came out in small puffs of fog, adding to the bizarre nature of the room. As I moved deeper inside, I heard a small clink. My eyes immediately snapped to the shelves in the corner. A jar of cleaning supplies had fallen off its perch, now resting on the floor at an odd angle. I hadn't touched it. I bent to pick it up, my mind racing with questions. How could this happen? There was no explanation. The shelf hadn't been disturbed, and yet the jar had somehow fallen. I returned it to its place, the chill in the air never easing. I paused, standing in the center of the room, listening. The air seemed too still, the silence stretching out too long. But then, just as I thought I had finally calmed down, I heard something. It was a soft whisper, a faint voice, but it wasn't a language I recognized. It was unintelligible, like a foreign tongue murmuring just out of reach. My skin crawled. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly turned, shining the flashlight around, but the room was empty. I rushed out of the back room, returning to the front of the store. The coldness in the air hadn't let up, and I could still hear that faint rustling, like something was moving just behind me. My nerves were stretched thin, every little sound amplifying the dread building in my chest. I tried to focus, to shake off the growing sense of panic. But the more I thought about it, the more the feeling persisted. I was not alone. The following night was no better. In fact, it was worse. It started with a sound of faint tapping, like the sound of fingernails against glass. It was soft at first, just a light tap 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 from somewhere in the store. But then it grew louder, more insistent. It came from the aisle near the front entrance. I moved cautiously toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. When I reached the end of the aisle, I found nothing. The tapping had stopped. I scanned the area, my gaze shifting over the empty shelves, the dimly lit store. Everything was still. I didn't trust myself to be alone in the store anymore. I had become hyper-aware of every little noise, every creak of the floor, every flicker of the lights. But it wasn't just the sounds. It was the way the store felt. The walls seemed to be closing in. The darkness seemed to linger longer than it should, and the air had an almost oppressive weight to it. The corners, once familiar, now seemed to hide things, shadows that weren't quite shadows. I walked to the stockroom again, my heart thumping in my chest. The door was ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light spill into the hallway. I peered inside. The room seemed as it always had, neatly organized, quiet. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my boots. As I moved further in, I noticed something unusual. There were footprints. The small, wet imprints were scattered across the floor, leading toward the back of the room. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way. No one had been back here all night, and the door had been closed. I knew I hadn't made those marks. The footprints were distinct-sized tin boots, their edges dark with moisture. I was frozen in place for a moment, staring at them. The last thing I needed was to jump at shadows, but it felt too real, too unnatural. I followed the prints, my flashlight scanning the ground in front of me. The footprints seemed to circle back around, leading me in a complete loop, until I stopped dead in my tracks. At the back of the room, where the footprint trail ended, was a small, rusted door. A door I had never seen before. My heart began to race as I walked toward it, a sense of dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. The door seemed out of place, old, weathered, as though it didn't belong in the store at all. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling as I gripped it. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing only blackness beyond it. I shone the flashlight into the dark space, but there was nothing. Just an endless void, like a room that didn't exist. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stared into the blackness, wondering what was on the other side. But there was no answer, no movement, no sound. I slowly closed the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footprints were gone now, as if they had never been there at all. My mind raced with questions. What had just happened? Was I losing it? I backed out of the room, locking the door behind me. The entire store felt different now. The air was too thick, the silence too heavy. It wasn't just the room, it was the entire building. Something was wrong. Something had changed, and it wasn't going to stop until I figured out what it was. Later that night, I checked the security footage. The feed from the front of the store was normal, but the back camera was corrupted static, as if it had been tampered with. It was the first time in my shift that the feed had glitched, and it felt like the store was toying with me. But as I reviewed the footage, something caught my eye. In the corner of the frame, just out of reach of the camera's line of sight, was a shadow. It was quick, fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I turned off the screen and sat back in my chair, my heart racing. The shadow wasn't a trick of the light. It was real, and I had no idea who or what it was. All I knew was that the store was hiding something it didn't want me to know. And whatever it was getting closer. Each night, the store's strange occurrences grew more frequent. The dragging sounds became louder, the cold air more suffocating. The lights flickered with increasing urgency. I was caught in the grip of something I couldn't explain, and every step I took toward the truth only seemed to bring me closer to the unknown. The unease that had been building for days finally reached its breaking point that night. The air in the store felt thicker than ever, as though the very walls were closing in. My mind was racing, constantly replaying the strange events from the past few shifts, the bottle falling off the shelf, the faint whispering voices, the unexplainable footsteps in the back room. But nothing could have prepared me for what would happen next. It started innocently enough. The clock had just passed 2 o'clock, and the store was dead silent, as it always was. I was at the front, manning the counter and checking the inventory for the next day's deliveries. The routine felt like a temporary escape from the creeping dread that had been following me. But as I looked up from the register, I felt it an undeniable, oppressive presence in the room. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the back aisle. Something was different. The shadows, once subtle and familiar, had grown darker, thicker. They seemed to be moving, shifting, almost alive. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, and not in a casual way. It was the kind of feeling you get when you realize someone is staring at you, waiting for you to make a move. I didn't hesitate. My instincts told me to check it out, but a small, panicked part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend nothing was happening, pretend it was all in my head. But I couldn't. There was no denying it anymore. I had to confront whatever was in that aisle. I stood up from the counter, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every step I took toward the back of the store felt heavier, as though the air itself was pressing down on me. The closer I got, the colder it became. A chill ran down my spine, making the hairs on my arms stand at attention. The store's lights flickered once, twice, before finally stabilizing, though I wasn't sure how long that would last. The fear inside me twisted tighter with every passing second. I rounded the corner into the aisle, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The shelves loomed over me, casting long shadows across the floor. I could see the faint imprint of a footprint in the dust, wet, dark, and fresh. I wasn't the one who made it. I hadn't been in this part of the store since I'd left for my break hours earlier. Then I heard it, a soft, wet scraping noise. I froze. It came from the back room, the room that had been so unsettling the night before. The room where I had found the strange footprints. The room where the rusted door had appeared from nowhere. I didn't want to go back there. I didn't want to open that door again, but something inside me was compelling me, urging me to take the next step. The voice inside my head wasn't mine, and it wasn't reassuring. I walked slowly toward the back of the store, the sound growing louder with each step. My mind raced. I wasn't sure what I was walking toward. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear nothing else. The scraping noise turned into a dragging sound, a faint thudding against the walls that reverberated deep inside me. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and I wondered if I was even still holding on to it. Then I reached the door, the one that had been locked the last time I'd seen it. Now it stood slightly ajar, just wide enough to send a wave of dread crashing over me. I pushed the door open, and the cold air hit me like a wall. The smell of mildew and something far more foul greeted me, filling my nose and making my stomach churn. I could barely see anything inside, but I felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, as if the room itself was alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The flashlight's beam flickered again, just for a moment. When it came back on, I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, its back to me. The light wasn't strong enough to show its face, but the outline was unmistakable. The figure was tall, thin, unnaturally so. The ragged clothes hung off it like they didn't belong, and the air around it seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was bending, warping in its presence. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped between the desire to flee and the sick curiosity that kept me there, staring. The figure moved, its head turning slowly toward me. I didn't see a face. There was nothing there, just darkness where the eyes should have been. A black void, like staring into an abyss that had no end. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath, the misty fog of fear rising from my lips. The figure took a step forward, and the scraping noise, the noise that had led me here, came from its movement, a low, guttural sound that made my insides twist. Without thinking, I turned and bolted from the room. My feet slapped against the cold floor as I ran through the store, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the figure following, its presence behind me, lurking in the corners of my mind. I didn't dare turn around. I just ran. I reached the front of the store and slammed the door shut, gasping for air. I didn't know how to process what had just happened. What was that thing? Why was it here? What did it want? I was shaking, my body trembling uncontrollably. I stood there for a few moments, trying to steady myself. My mind was in chaos. I couldn't make sense of anything. The store felt wrong now, like it had become something else entirely. And then the lights went out. Complete darkness enveloped the store, cutting off every sense of reality. My heart raced again, pounding in my chest as the silence settled around me. There was no hum of the lights, no sound of the air conditioning running. It was like the store had swallowed every noise, leaving me in a void. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers slick with sweat as I tried to turn it on. The beam flickered weakly before illuminating just a few feet in front of me. And that's when I saw it. The figure was standing right in front of me. It had moved faster than I could have ever imagined. I hadn't heard it, hadn't sensed it approaching. One moment, I was alone in the dark, and the next, it was there. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It had form hunched, like a broken marionette, its joints twisted and wrong. Its hands thin and claw-like reached out toward me. I stepped back, but the figure was closer now. Too close. I could feel the cold emanating from it, the air growing thick and oppressive. It was suffocating, the weight of it pushing down on my chest. In that moment, I realized that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't just haunting the store. It had been waiting for me, and I had been walking into its trap from the moment I first stepped into that shift. Every noise, every flicker of light, every chilling moment, it was all part of something bigger. Something that was coming for me. I turned and ran again, my heart nearly stopping in my chest as I heard its footsteps following me, scraping across the floor, dragging itself closer. I didn't dare look back. I had no idea how long I ran, but I didn't stop. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurry, but I couldn't afford to slow down. Somewhere, deep in my mind, I heard the whisper of a thought you can't escape. And that thought was the one thing that almost broke me. I don't know how long I ran, for maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time had blurred into a haze of panic and adrenaline. the dark corners of the store seeming to stretch on endlessly, each one holding some new horror. My breath was coming in gasps now, my chest tight, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it get me. I had to get out. The front door finally, I reached it. My fingers fumbled for the handle, slick with sweat. The metal felt cold beneath my touch, and I yanked as hard as I could. For a moment, nothing happened. My heart dropped into my stomach as I realized the door wouldn't budge. Locked. The door was locked. The figure had caught up with me. I could feel it, a weight in the air that wasn't just oppressive, it was suffocating. I turned around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and there it was. That terrible thing from the back room, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on me, its hands stretched out as if it was ready to grab hold of me and never let go. I staggered back, my eyes scanning the room for any escape. But there was none. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. My mind screamed at me, and the terror clawed at my insides. The creature, it wasn't just haunting the store. It had been waiting for me, waiting for anyone who wandered into its territory. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing inward as if they too were part of this nightmare. The figure took another step forward. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I couldn't think straight. My panic was clouding my thoughts, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. I had two choices: stay and let it take me, or try something, anything to survive. And without fully thinking about it, I acted. I bolted toward the back aisle. The sound of the creature's dragging footsteps followed me, but I didn't dare look back. I had to get to the back room, to that strange, rusted door. Maybe there was something there. Maybe it could give me a way out. I didn't know how, but I had to try. I reached the door and shoved it open with all my strength, half expecting it to resist, half expecting to find something worse waiting inside. But no, the room was empty. The air was thick and cold, but it was empty. My flashlight flickered and barely illuminated the room, but I didn't care. I didn't need to see clearly, I just needed to do something. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, even though I knew that wouldn't keep the creature out. It wasn't the door I was afraid of. It was what was behind it, the thing that followed me, the thing that had haunted the store since I first started this job. I stood there in the silence, trying to steady my breath, trying to think. My hands were trembling, my heart still racing. I couldn't hear the creature's footsteps anymore. There was no scraping, no dragging, just the silence. For a moment, I thought I might have escaped. Maybe I had outrun it. But then, just as I started to allow myself to relax, something changed. A low, guttural sound. A scrape, just faint enough to make me question if I had imagined it. But it wasn't in my head. I could feel it, hear it, a noise too real to ignore. And then, the lights went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest, every nerve on edge. The air was impossibly cold now. The only sound was the frantic thudding of my heartbeat in my ears, the slow, deliberate scrape of something moving toward me in the pitch black. And then, the door. It began to rattle, not from the outside, but from within. It was as if something was trying to get inside. I could hear its slow, deliberate, scraping, dragging. The thing behind the door. The thing that had been following me, had been waiting for me. It was getting closer. I stumbled backward, but there was no room to retreat. The room was closing in on me, and with every second, the presence behind the door grew stronger, more oppressive. The scraping grew louder, and soon, it was no longer a subtle sound, it was deafening, like something was dragging across the floor, coming for me. My flashlight flickered one last time, and then darkness. The creature wasn't just behind the door anymore. It was in the room with me. I could feel it. I didn't need to see it. It was there. The air was thick with its presence, and I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. It was here, and it wanted me. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice strangled in fear. The cold surrounded me, an icy pressure that made it hard to breathe. The creature's breath, if it could be called that, was a foul, sickly wind that brushed against my skin, and I could feel its presence moving around me. Its hands were outstretched, and I was certain it was only a matter of time before it grabbed me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, everything stopped. The scraping noise ceased. The coldness that had gripped me released its hold. The pressure in the room lifted. I was alone again. I don't know how long I stood there, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't understand it. What was it? Why had it come for me? Was I ever truly safe? After what felt like an eternity, the lights flickered back on, casting their pale glow over the room. The store was still, silent, but the damage had already been done. I didn't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes or maybe hours. I wasn't sure. I was just so lost in my thoughts, trying to grasp what had happened. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. I left the store in a daze, stumbling out the front door and into the night. The cool air felt like a breath of life after suffocating in that place. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, still watching me, waiting. Even now, I can't be sure if I truly escaped. The thought lingers in the back of my mind, the sense that whatever was inside that store was still out there, still hunting, and I can't help but wonder, was I the only one who had ever heard it? I still don't know what happened that night. It's been weeks, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something is watching me, something that I can't explain. The store I worked at has been shut down ever since, and they've transferred everyone to other locations. They never gave us a reason, just a vague explanation about safety concerns and maintenance issues. But I know better. Whatever was there, whatever I felt, was never meant to be left alone. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some broken equipment or a power surge. That thing, whatever it was waiting for me. I still think about the store sometimes, about the quiet hum of the lights, the aisles filled with nothing but shadows. And every time I do, I feel that same cold grip, that same fear that twisted in my chest the night I saw it. But now, I try not to dwell on it too much. I've moved on. I've found new work in a different city, and I've made sure never to go back to that area. It's just better that way. Sometimes though, when I'm lying awake at night, I hear that same scraping sound. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there. I can't help but listen, hoping it's nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. But the truth is, I can't be sure anymore. Maybe I never escaped it. Maybe it followed me here, or maybe it was always there, hiding just beyond the reach of my awareness. I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting. I've told a few friends about what happened, but I can tell they don't believe me. They think it was just stress or a vivid nightmare. They say I probably just imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I know it wasn't just in my head. It was real. And no amount of time or distance will ever change that. In the end, I guess there's nothing I can do to explain what happened. There's no way to make sense of it. Maybe there are things in this world that can't be understood, things that defy reason or logic. And maybe, sometimes, it's better not to know the truth at all. But as I sit here in the quiet of my apartment, trying to push away the thoughts of that night, I can't help but wonder, what if it's not over? What if the thing I ran from is still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down? What if it's always been there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike again? This happened a few years ago in a small neighborhood just outside the city. The kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing ever seems out of place. I was living alone in a modest house on a quiet street, and my days were typically filled with work, errands, and the occasional dinner with friends. My routine was predictable: wake up early, work a 9 to 5 job, and come home to the comfort of my own space. It was a Wednesday when it all started. The morning had been nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was just beginning to peek through the blinds of my living room, casting a warm glow over the furniture. I had my coffee in hand, still in my pajamas, scrolling through my phone. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the occasional bird chirping outside, and the soft rustle of trees swaying with the wind. It was peaceful, calm, and serene, the kind of morning that felt timeless, like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I lived in this house for about 2 years by that point, and nothing strange had ever occurred. I had grown accustomed to the solitude, the quiet moments of reflection. Sure, I'd had my fair share of oddities, who hasn't? A creaky floorboard here and there, the occasional draft when the windows were open, or the sound of something moving in the attic during the night. But none of that was out of the ordinary. It was just the house settling, or so I thought. On that particular morning, as I went to the front door to grab the mail, I noticed something unusual, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was a package sitting on my doorstep. A plain brown box, about the size of a shoebox, with no return address. No stamps. Nothing. Just a perfectly normal-looking package, placed neatly on a welcome mat, as if it had been delivered by someone who knew exactly where it was supposed to go. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, unsure of what to do. I hadn't ordered anything recently, and no one had mentioned sending me anything. It wasn't like me to forget about a delivery either. The more I stared at it, the more uncomfortable I felt, as if the box was waiting for me. But I shrugged it off. I figured it was some sort of mistake, maybe a package for a neighbor that had been misdelivered. Still, there was something in the back of my mind that nagged at me. I don't know if it was the sheer ordinariness of the package, or the fact that it arrived with no information that unsettled me so much, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. After a moment of hesitation, I bent down to pick up the box. It wasn't heavy, just light enough to make me think it was filled with something small or delicate. My fingers brushed the surface of the cardboard, and I instantly felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but something about touching it felt off. I carried it inside, setting it down on the kitchen counter. The house felt unnaturally still, the air thick with an uncomfortable silence. Even the usual hum of the refrigerator seemed louder in the quiet. I stared at the package for a moment longer, as if waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I began to wonder whether I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just a forgotten delivery from someone who lived nearby. Maybe I should open it and move on with my day. And so, I did. But as I cut open the tape and peeled back the cardboard, I had no idea that this simple act would set off a chain of events that would change everything. I tore open the box, my heart still pounding in my chest, the uncomfortable feeling lingering in the back of my mind. The box was filled with packing peanuts, and after carefully removing them, I uncovered the object inside. At first glance, it seemed completely normal. A small silver key, glinting faintly in the light. I picked it up, inspecting it closely. It wasn't ornate or special in any way, just a simple, utilitarian key. It looked like something you might use for a lockbox or a storage unit. The key was old, worn around the edges, but still in good condition. I turned it over, expecting to find a brand name or some sort of marking, but there was nothing. It was completely blank. I stood there, staring at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The strange thing was, I couldn't remember ever needing a key like this. It didn't match anything in my house. Nothing I had locked recently, nothing I could think of that would require such a key. I set it down on the kitchen counter, its cold metal against the warm wood, and stood back for a second. It felt wrong, somehow. The weight of the situation, the emptiness of the package, it all started to build up in my mind. Who had sent it? Why? And why was I receiving something so cryptic? I turned the key over in my hands again, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. There was a moment of tension in the air, almost as if I was waiting for the key to reveal its purpose. But nothing happened. I tried to shake it off, rationalizing the situation. Maybe it was just a mistake, some sort of promotion, or an accident. Maybe it was even meant for the previous tenant, someone who had lived in the house before me. I brushed it off, thinking that it would be best to just forget about it and move on. The day continued normally, or at least it tried to. I went back to my routine, checking my emails, grabbing a quick bite to eat, and heading out to run some errands. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept drifting back to the key, wondering if it was somehow connected to something I had missed. It felt as if there was a piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite fit into place. By the time evening rolled around, I had completely forgotten about the key in the chaos of my day. I had returned home, kicked off my shoes, and settled in for a quiet night. I made dinner and went about my business, trying to drown out the nagging thoughts. It wasn't until I was preparing to go to bed that something strange happened. As I entered the kitchen, I saw the key sitting on the counter, just as I had left it. But it wasn't where I had left it. The key had moved slightly, shifted a few inches from its original position. The rest of the counter was undisturbed. No other items had been touched, no signs of anyone else being there. I froze. I hadn't moved it, and I was sure no one else had been in the house. My heart began to race as I scanned the room, looking for an explanation. I checked the door locks secure. Windows closed. The house was still. But that one detail, the movement of the key, couldn't be ignored. A chill ran through me, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had just forgotten where I had placed it earlier. Maybe I'd accidentally nudged it when I was going about my day. The idea of someone sneaking into my home seemed impossible. There was no sign of forced entry, and I lived in a fairly quiet neighborhood. Still, I couldn't help but feel unsettled by the situation. I picked up the key again, inspecting it for any new signs of damage or marks. Nothing. It looked exactly as it had that morning, but now it felt heavier in my hand, as if it had somehow taken on a greater significance, one that I wasn't yet able to understand. I decided to do what I thought was the rational thing. I'd just get rid of it, toss it in the trash, and forget about it. The only problem was, as soon as I approached the trash can, I felt a strong hesitation. It was as if my body was rebelling against the idea of throwing it away, telling me that I needed to hold on to it for some reason. So, instead of throwing it out, I tucked the key into the drawer where I kept my spare change and other random items out of sight, out of mind. I told myself it was a bizarre, inexplicable event that I would eventually forget. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something about that key about the package felt like a warning, a clue to something I wasn't yet able to comprehend. The next few days passed without much incident, but the unease lingered. Every time I opened that drawer, I couldn't help but glance at the key, as if it were somehow watching me. The days grew longer, the nights colder, and with every passing moment, the house felt smaller, as if it was closing in around me. It wasn't until later that week when the second strange occurrence happened. I had been at work, sitting in my office, when I received a phone call from an unknown number. It wasn't the first time it had happened, but I usually let unknown calls go to voicemail. Something, however, compelled me to pick up. I answered the phone, only to hear static on the other end. It wasn't the usual kind either. It was unnerving, like something or someone was trying to speak through the static, but their voice couldn't quite reach me. I sat in silence for a few moments, listening intently, waiting for the other person to speak. But there was nothing, just the crackling static. Then, right before I was about to hang up, I heard a single, chilling sentence, barely audible, but clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Did you find it?" The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time, completely frozen. Who was that? How did they know about the key? Was it a prank? Was someone messing with me? But the more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. I had no answers, only questions. And for the first time since receiving the package, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. What had I gotten myself into? It wasn't the type of thing you could easily brush off. The feeling that something was watching me, that something was waiting, was growing stronger every day. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was as if the key, the package, the call, everything was part of a larger, more sinister puzzle, one that I was unwillingly a part of. But that's when I realized I wasn't going to be able to ignore this for much longer. Someone was trying to tell me something, and I had no choice but to listen. At first, it seemed like an ordinary stretch of time, but every small thing, every insignificant detail, began to take on new meaning. The events surrounding that key, the package, the strange phone call, they all started to pile up, compounding the unease that had already taken root in my mind. It began one morning when I found a scrap of paper on my doorstep. I had no memory of hearing the doorbell ring or of anyone knocking, but there it was, sitting there like an unwanted guest. The paper was old, yellowed, like something you might find in an attic or a forgotten drawer. The handwriting was strange, uneven, slanted, like it had been written in haste or with a trembling hand. I unfolded it carefully, the edges crackling under my fingers. The message was short. The key has a purpose. You must find the lock. No signature. No return address. Just those words. I stood there on my porch, staring at the paper, feeling the morning sunlight warm my skin as my thoughts raced. This wasn't just a random note. This was connected to the key that had appeared out of nowhere. The key that had moved by itself on my kitchen counter. The key that I had tried to ignore, but now I knew deep down I couldn't. With that note in my hand, the mystery deepened. Who was sending these cryptic messages? And why? It was almost as if the universe was conspiring to make sure I couldn't escape this strange, escalating game. That day, the tension in the house was palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. As I went about my day, I noticed that I was jumpier than usual. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise from outside, seemed magnified, amplified, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, the air in the house grew colder, and the strange feeling in my gut grew sharper. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly, trying to distract myself. But I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the key, the note, the phone call. It was like I was trapped in a loop I couldn't escape. Then, suddenly, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The front door? My bedroom door? I didn't know, but I immediately stood up, moving cautiously toward the source of the noise. The hallway was dark, the dim light from the living room casting long shadows on the walls. I took a slow step forward, my breath shallow. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, the normal creaks and groans that came with an old place. But I knew better now. This wasn't just the house. Something had changed. I reached the hallway, my footsteps barely audible on the carpet. The door to the spare bedroom at the end of the hall was open, just a crack, but enough to let the shadows spill out onto the floor. The room was empty. Nothing was out of place. But still, the air felt charged, heavy, as if something had been there. Something unseen, something that had slipped away the moment I entered the room. I didn't know why I did it, but I found myself walking to the dresser, opening the drawer where I had hidden the key. I couldn't explain it, but I had a sickening feeling that I needed to check it again. The key was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space where I had left it, my hands shaking. The drawer wasn't even open fully, just enough to reveal that the key was no longer inside. My pulse quickened, and I slammed the drawer shut, my mind spiraling. What the hell was going on? I rushed back to the living room, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked every corner of the house, under furniture, in the bathroom, even in the laundry room. But the key was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had vanished, disappeared into thin air. I sat on the couch, my head spinning. I was on the verge of panic when I heard it again. The phone ringing. I hesitated before picking up the receiver, afraid of what might be on the other end. But I did it anyway, desperation in my voice. "Hello?" This time, there was no static, no crackling interference, just the cold, eerie silence. But then, in that silence, I heard the voice. It's not just the key, it's the lock. You have to find it. The line went dead once more. I sat there, holding the receiver, my mind reeling. The voice, the message, it was all connected to the key. But what lock was it referring to? Where was this lock? And why was it so important? Over the next few days, I began to investigate. I researched locks, keys, and cryptic messages, hoping to find some clue that could explain the madness that was consuming my life. But all I found were dead ends. There was no record of anything related to the key or the note I had received. Nothing about the strange phone call. It was as if I had stumbled into an uncharted world of bizarre, unexplained events. I started walking around the neighborhood, hoping for some insight. I spoke to a few of my neighbors, asking if they had seen anything unusual, but no one had. The area was quiet, peaceful, a place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But as I walked the streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Not physically, no, it was something much deeper than that. A sense that someone or something was always just out of view, watching me, waiting. The air grew heavier, the atmosphere thick with tension. I began to see strange things out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting, flickers of movement just beyond my line of sight. It was all so subtle, but I felt it. Every inch of my skin prickled with a sense that something was wrong. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. I decided to confront the house itself. I started looking for anything that might be connected to the key, anything that could reveal the mystery behind it. I checked the basement, the attic, every closet, every cupboard. Nothing. It was as if the house was hiding something from me, something that was right under my nose, something that I just couldn't see. But that night, I felt it. Something had changed. The air was thick with a suffocating stillness, the silence too heavy to ignore. I had just returned home from another fruitless search when I noticed it. On the kitchen counter, the key. It was back. The key was sitting there, exactly where I had last seen it. But this time, there was something else. A small slip of paper beside it. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I read the words. You found it. Now find the lock. I felt my stomach twist. The game was no longer a distant mystery. It was here in my home, and I was no longer in control. The lock was out there somewhere, and the only way to find it was to keep searching through every door, every corner, every hidden space in my life. But as I stood there, holding the key in my hand, I knew one thing for certain. The air had never felt so heavy. Every corner of the house seemed to close in on me, as if the walls themselves were shrinking, the very foundation trembling beneath my feet. The key still in my hand felt warm now, like it was alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. I had always been cautious, always thinking things through, but now I was just reacting. It was like a dark force had swept over me, dragging me forward into something I could no longer control. The house had grown silent in the past few days, as though it had been waiting for me to take the next step. There were no more knocks on the door, no more mysterious phone calls, just a lingering, suffocating feeling that something was coming, something inevitable. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the key, gripping it so tightly that my knuckles were white. The paper that had been left beside it was crumpled in my other hand, the words written on it still burning in my mind. You found it. Now find the lock. But where? What was this lock that the messages kept referring to? I hadn't slept properly in days. I couldn't. The weight of the mystery had grown too much for my mind to process. It was as if the world around me was becoming more and more unreal, and I was beginning to question whether this was truly happening or if I had finally lost my grip on reality. The darkness outside the windows seemed to stretch further into the house with each passing minute. I had tried everything, searching the attic again, going through every room in the house with a fine-tooth comb, but there was no lock. No trace of what I was supposed to be looking for. The messages kept coming, each one more cryptic than the last, and yet nothing made sense. And then, as if on cue, it happened. The lights flickered, casting strange, disjointed shadows across the room. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, something mundane, something easily explained. But the flickering grew more intense, longer, as if the house itself was reacting to my frustration. The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill seeping into my bones. I could see my breath in front of me, each exhale forming a cloud in the freezing air. The key burned in my palm. The sensation was unbearable. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. It felt like the world was pressing in on me from all sides. I looked around the kitchen once more, my eyes scanning for any sign of the lock. And that's when I saw it, just a glimmer, a flicker of light from the corner of my eye. I turned toward the old wooden cupboard beside the sink. At first glance, it seemed like any other piece of furniture in the house, worn and ordinary. But there was something different about it now, something I hadn't noticed before. It was as if it had always been there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for me to notice it. My hands trembled as I reached for the cupboard door. Slowly, I pulled it open, and to my shock, I found something I hadn't expected. There inside was a locked box. The lock was old, intricate, with strange symbols etched into the surface. It was as though it had been waiting for me, waiting for the key to arrive. The key in my hand seemed to resonate with the box, as though they were connected in ways I couldn't understand. I could feel my heart racing as I brought the key to the lock. It was now or never. With a single turn, the lock clicked open. In that moment, everything changed. The house seemed to groan under the pressure, the air thick with an unnatural force. The temperature plummeted even further, and a deep, resonating sound filled the room, like a growl from the very bowels of the earth. My eyes went wide as I stared at what lay inside the box. It wasn't just an object. It was something ancient, a relic, a piece of something far bigger than I could comprehend. The moment I touched it, everything shifted, reality itself, bending and warping, like the world around me was crumbling apart at the edges. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, my head spinning, my mind unable to process what was happening. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows in the room seemed to surge forward, engulfing everything in their path, swallowing the light. The key I had held so tightly now felt heavy and distant, as if it no longer belonged to me. And then, as the room seemed to collapse in on itself, I saw it, a figure tall, imposing, its features hidden in the swirling darkness. It was standing just behind the box, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel its eyes on me, its gaze penetrating deep into my soul. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, and with it, a voice echoed through the room. A voice that wasn't human. A voice that belonged to something far older, far more powerful than anything I had ever known. "You have opened the door," it said, its tone cold, like the wind before a storm. "And now you must face the consequences." The words reverberated in my skull, and a wave of terror washed over me. My skin crawled as the air around me grew denser, heavier, and I could feel the presence of the figure closing in, its shadow growing ever larger. I could no longer tell where the figure ended and the darkness began. Then, everything went black. Maybe I had hoped that everything would be back to normal, that the darkness would be gone, and the house would feel like home again. But instead, I was met with an eerie stillness, the kind that seems to press in on you from all sides. I blinked, trying to focus, but my vision swam as if I had just been submerged in water. The weight of the air felt heavier than before, thick and suffocating. The oppressive darkness that had overtaken the room was now gone, replaced by a dim, unnatural light. I could see the outline of the box still on the floor, the lock that had once seemed so ominous, now wide open, empty. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. The shadows that had consumed the room were gone, but the feeling of dread lingered, a constant hum in the back of my mind. It was as if the very fabric of the house had been altered by whatever had just happened. And in the silence, I couldn't help but feel that something was still watching me. I stumbled out of the kitchen, unsure of where I was going, just needing to get away from the feeling that seemed to cling to me. The house felt different, like it had been marked somehow. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, my heart still pounding in my chest, my breath ragged. The cold night air hit me like a shock, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the doorstep. The stillness of the night was unsettling. It was too quiet, like everything had been waiting for me to leave. I drove without thinking, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from that house as possible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the figure, still hear its voice, the cold words echoing in my mind. You have opened the door, and now you must face the consequences. What did that even mean? What had I unleashed? Was it over? Or was it only the beginning? I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The key in my pocket, the one I had taken with me, seemed to burn through the fabric of my jacket. The weight of it was unbearable, like a reminder that I wasn't free, not really. The road ahead was empty, the lights from the car casting long shadows on the pavement. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I pulled it out, hoping for some kind of distraction, some kind of normalcy. But when I saw the message, my blood ran cold. You left too soon. The lock is still open, and it's waiting for you. The text was from an unknown number. There was no name, no other details, just those chilling words. My hand shook as I dropped the phone back into my lap. This couldn't be happening. I had to be losing my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just in my head. I wasn't the only one who had felt the presence in that house. I wasn't the only one who had heard the voice. Something had been awakened, and I had no idea how to stop it. I pulled over to the side of the road, my pulse racing as I struggled to calm my breathing. I had to think. I had to make sense of this. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, one truth remained. Whatever had been in that box, whatever had been unleashed, wasn't something I could escape from. It was out there, and it was waiting. And then the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture, a blurry image of the house, with the door slightly ajar. The lock was still there, just barely visible in the low light. The caption below the picture sent a wave of nausea through me. I didn't return to the house. I couldn't. Something inside me, something primal and terrified, refused to let me go back there. I stayed in a hotel that night, trying to escape the persistent feeling of being watched. The cold sweat on the back of my neck, the constant buzz of my phone with its cryptic messages, none of it seemed real, but it was. Days passed, and the world moved on, indifferent to the chaos I had just experienced. But I couldn't forget. The fear still lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. And no matter how many times I told myself that it was over, that I had escaped, the truth kept nagging at me. That door, that lock, what if it wasn't truly closed? I tried to resume my normal life. Work, errands, even going out with friends. But every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of a light, sent my heart racing. I could never completely relax. The dread followed me like a silent companion, whispering that my escape had been temporary, that whatever had been unleashed was still out there, waiting. I kept the key with me, even though I had no idea what to do with it. It felt like a lifeline, a connection to something I didn't fully understand but couldn't let go of. Perhaps it was a reminder of my failure, of the price I had paid for seeking answers I wasn't prepared for. The messages stopped. No more texts, no more pictures. But I didn't find comfort in that. I couldn't help but wonder what it meant. Was it gone? Had the entity, whatever it was, decided to leave me in peace? Or was I merely the calm before the storm, biding my time before something worse came for me? Months later, I heard rumors about the house. People said it had been bought by someone else, someone who was foolish enough to move in. They didn't stay long. The house was empty again, abandoned and forgotten. But even in the silence, the air around it felt wrong. People began to whisper about strange happenings in the neighborhood, flickering lights, cold spots, the feeling of being watched at all times. The door had been opened, and whatever lay behind it hadn't just vanished. It had followed me, biding its time, waiting for the next opportunity. Maybe it would wait for the next person to unknowingly stumble across the key. Maybe it was already planning its return. It was one of those weekends when everything felt perfectly normal, maybe even a bit too calm. I had been working hard, the usual 9 to 5 grind, and as soon as Friday evening rolled around, I found myself itching for an escape. Something to break the routine, something to ground me in nature. A hike. I had always been fond of the outdoors. There was something peaceful about being alone in the woods, away from the buzzing of everyday life. It clears your mind and resets your energy. I called up a few friends, hoping they'd be interested in joining me, but most had other plans. So it ended up being just me and one of my closest friends, Nathan. We'd gone on hikes before, a handful of times throughout the years. It was always a bonding experience for us. No matter how busy life got, we could always count on each other when it came to heading out into nature. Nathan was easygoing, a bit of a free spirit. He had a way of making any outing feel like an adventure, even if it was just a casual walk through the woods. That's why I enjoyed these trips with him. He wasn't the type to get bogged down by small problems or inconveniences. If something didn't go as planned, he'd just laugh it off and suggest another way to enjoy the moment. We had planned on heading out early on Saturday morning, hoping to get a nice start to the day before the crowds began filling the trail. I remember how the air felt that morning crisp, with a slight chill that hinted at the transition between late summer and early fall. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but you could already see the sky lightening as we loaded up the car and made our way to the trailhead. It's funny, looking back, how quickly things can go from feeling so ordinary to something else entirely. The drive to the forest was uneventful. Nathan and I talked about the usual things: work, life, a few jokes thrown in for good measure. By the time we arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. A good sign. We were both in a quiet, reflective mood, more excited for the fresh air than anything else. We grabbed our packs, making sure we had everything we needed: water, snacks, a first aid kit, the usual stuff. I always made sure we were prepared, but Nathan, as usual, was a little more laid back. He didn't mind not having every single thing checked off on the list. The trail we chose was one we'd hiked before. It was a well-maintained path that wound through the trees, leading up a small hill and then down into a valley before looping back. Nothing too strenuous, but it offered the kind of scenery that made the journey worth it: dense forests, streams with clear water, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. It was a trail meant for those who wanted to get away from the hustle, but didn't need to prove anything by hiking mountains. The first part of the hike was peaceful, the way it always is when you first start out. We walked in silence for the most part, only exchanging a few words here and there. I remember thinking how nice it was to be out there, no distractions, no deadlines hanging over my head. Just the simple rhythm of walking. It was still early, and the sun was just starting to filter through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. As we made our way through the woods, the sounds of nature surrounded us. Birds chirped from the treetops, and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze added to the atmosphere. Everything felt right, normal. But then, as we continued along the path, I began to notice something that made me stop in my tracks. A feeling. It wasn't a sound or a visible thing, just a sensation, something strange in the air. At first, I chalked it up to being overcautious, maybe just my mind playing tricks after spending so many hours indoors. But there it was, that weird feeling, something just out of place. I looked over at Nathan, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He was still walking ahead, humming a tune, lost in his own world. I shook it off and followed him, trying not to let my mind wander too much. I didn't want to ruin the peace with unnecessary worry. We continued on, and I could feel the sensation grow stronger. It wasn't just the air, it was like the woods themselves were different. More still, more aware. But again, Nathan was oblivious. I didn't say anything to him. If I was just imagining things, I didn't want to sound paranoid. The trail began to twist and turn as we descended into the valley. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow more distant, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. We reached a small clearing and paused to rest. We sat down on a large rock, sipping water, both of us content for the moment. It wasn't until we stood up to continue that I noticed something else: the trail ahead. It didn't look the way I remembered it. It was subtle at first, just an odd curve in the path where there hadn't been one before. The trees seemed to stand a little closer, and there was an unfamiliar scent in the air, something earthy, damp, like wet stone. I brushed it off, telling myself that I just wasn't paying attention the last time we were here. "Hey, Nathan," I called, trying to sound casual. "Does this trail look different to you?" He turned around, looking at me like I was overthinking things. "Different?" "Nah, it looks the same." "You good?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just weird." Let's keep going. We moved forward, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest didn't feel welcoming anymore. There was an eerie stillness in the air, like something was waiting. We walked deeper into the woods, but now it felt like the trees were closing in on us. The sky above was no longer visible through the canopy, and the shadows seemed darker, thicker. Still, I didn't say anything to Nathan. He didn't seem concerned, and I didn't want to make him uncomfortable. The further we went, the more pronounced the oddities became. The trail seemed to twist in unnatural ways, and the landscape started to shift. It was as if we were walking in a place that didn't belong in this world, something otherworldly. But we kept going, because what else were we supposed to do? This was just a hike, right? We continued along the trail, the quiet of the forest growing deeper around us. The feeling I'd been trying to dismiss only intensified. Each step felt heavier, and I couldn't help but feel as though we were being watched. The air had a coldness to it that hadn't been there before, and the quietness of the forest was starting to feel unnatural, almost suffocating. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, we were deep in the woods, miles away from any sign of civilization. Nature has a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when you're alone with your thoughts. But something was different about this place. The longer we stayed, the more I felt this unshakable sense that the forest wasn't quite as peaceful as it seemed. Nathan, ever the optimist, didn't seem to notice. He was ahead of me, whistling a tune as we walked. But his easygoing demeanor didn't do much to put my mind at ease. It was like there was a disconnect between us. He was lost in the rhythm of the hike, while I couldn't stop feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on us. The first odd thing happened when we approached a small creek that crossed the path. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a shallow stream with rocks scattered across the bed, providing an easy crossing. I stepped onto the first rock, balancing myself carefully, when something caught my eye. There, at the edge of the water, was a small patch of disturbed earth. It wasn't much, just a few marks, as if something had been dragged across the ground. But the soil around it was strangely fresh, almost like it had been recently disturbed, and the marks were too irregular to be anything natural. I stopped, crouching to get a closer look. It was like the dirt had been shifted recently, but it wasn't as if someone had walked there. It was as if something had been dragged or pulled across the earth. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey, Nathan," I called, my voice a little more strained than I intended. "Come look at this." Nathan stopped and turned around, his face lit by a casual grin. "What is it now, man? You found another weird rock?" "No, seriously. Look at this," I said, pointing to the marks on the ground. He walked over, squatting down beside me. I watched as his expression shifted, just for a second, like he saw what I was seeing, but couldn't quite place it. He ran his hand through the dirt, his fingers lightly brushing the surface. "It's nothing," Nathan said after a moment. "Probably just some animal." I wasn't so sure. The more I looked at it, the more I felt like the disturbance in the earth didn't belong. It wasn't just an animal, at least not anything I could recognize. But I didn't push it. Nathan was right. It could have been an animal. After all, we were deep in the forest, surrounded by wildlife. My mind was just making things out to be worse than they were. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to brush it off. "I'll keep an eye out for anything else." Nathan didn't say anything, just shrugged and continued on. But I stayed back for a moment longer, staring at the spot where the earth had been disturbed. My instincts were telling me to be cautious, to turn back and leave, but I ignored them. We were in the woods, and there were always strange things that happened in the wild. I crossed the creek and caught up with Nathan, who was already a few paces ahead. The air around us seemed to have grown colder, a biting chill that wasn't there before. I zipped up my jacket and pulled the collar higher around my neck, but the sensation of unease didn't fade. As we continued walking, I kept my attention on the path ahead, but my mind kept returning to the strange marks by the creek. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And that's when we heard it. A sharp crack like a twig snapping underfoot suddenly broke the silence. Both Nathan and I froze. I turned my head toward the sound, but saw nothing. The woods were as still as ever, the trees towering above us in complete silence. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of any animal, no movement in the underbrush. "What the hell was that?" Nathan muttered, his voice low. He looked around, his usual carefree expression replaced with a hint of concern. "I don't know," I said, my voice a bit shaky. It sounded like someone. Another crack. This time, it was closer. Too close. We both looked around, but the forest was just as quiet as it had been. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the eerie silence that had begun to settle around us. "What's going on?" Nathan asked, his voice tense. I didn't know how to answer. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The unsettling feeling I had been ignoring was now impossible to ignore. I could feel it in my bones. The air felt thicker, heavier. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't sure if it was my nerves playing tricks on me or something more. I glanced over at Nathan, who seemed to be trying to shake off the tension. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. "Maybe a deer or something." But I didn't believe him. There was no way that a deer could make that sound. It wasn't just a crack, it had been too deliberate, too intentional. And whatever it was close. We stood there for a moment, just listening. The crackling noise seemed to have stopped, but the air was thick with the sense of something lurking just out of sight. I turned back to the path and started walking again, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. "Let's just keep going. We're fine." Nathan didn't reply, but I could feel the tension in his shoulders as he fell into step beside me. The forest felt different now, colder and darker, and the silence was almost suffocating. I kept telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that everything was fine, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next few minutes passed in relative silence. We walked at a faster pace, not speaking, both of us keenly aware of the strange stillness that hung in the air. The trees around us seemed to grow denser, the light dimming as the shadows stretched longer. And that's when we saw it. At the edge of the path, hidden behind a cluster of trees, was something dark and twisted. It was hard to make out at first, but as we drew closer, it became clearer. A tree, but not just any tree. The bark was twisted, warped, like something unnatural had forced its way through. The branches were gnarled, reaching out like twisted fingers, and the leaves were an unnatural shade of gray. Neither of us said a word. We just stood there, staring at it, our hearts pounding in our chests. I couldn't look away. It was like the tree was calling to me, pulling me in, but every instinct in my body screamed to turn away. Nathan stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. Is that real?" "I don't know," I said, barely able to form the words. "It doesn't look right." We stood there for a long time, just watching the tree, our minds racing to make sense of it. But there was no explanation, only the growing sense that we were no longer alone in this forest. We kept walking, but the forest felt different now, more oppressive, heavier. The cold air had grown sharper, biting at our skin, and the silence had thickened around us like a heavy fog. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the underbrush seemed amplified. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. Nathan, however, remained oblivious, continuing to talk about some random thing he saw on the internet earlier that day. His voice, once soothing, now felt strained, like he was trying to mask his own discomfort. I couldn't concentrate on his words. My mind kept returning to that twisted tree and the unsettling feeling it had stirred within me. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like it had been watching us. That's the only way I could describe it. I shook the thought from my head, trying to focus on the trail ahead. But something else was off. As we continued along the path, the trees grew thicker, their trunks closer together, blocking out the last traces of sunlight. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was as if the forest had turned in on itself, like we were walking deeper into some unseen heart of darkness. I glanced at Nathan, but his face was locked in that expression of casual ignorance. How could he not feel it? How could he not sense that something was wrong? We walked for what felt like hours, the world around us growing darker with each step. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that had taken root in my chest, but it was impossible. Every creak of a branch or snap of a twig sent a surge of dread through my body. And then we heard it again. The crack. It was sharper this time, unmistakable. I froze. My body tensed, every muscle on edge. Nathan turned toward me, his expression suddenly shifting from indifference to something more. Confused. I could see the tension creeping into his face now, too. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I muttered, looking around. The forest was eerily still. Nothing moved. No birds, no animals, just the sound of our breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. The crack had come from somewhere off the path, deeper in the trees. "Maybe it's just a squirrel or something," Nathan suggested, but his words lacked conviction. I shook my head. "It's not a squirrel. It's too deliberate." He didn't say anything, but I saw him glance around warily, his eyes scanning the forest. We stood there for a long moment, listening. The tension in the air was palpable. I could hear my breath, sharp and shallow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Finally, I turned toward the source of the sound. "Let's check it out," I said, barely believing the words as they left my mouth. But something in me, the same instinct that had made me pause at the creek, urged me forward. Nathan hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Okay, but let's make it quick." We stepped off the path, pushing our way through the dense underbrush, the trees closing in around us. The deeper we went, the more suffocating the air became. It smelled of decay, like something was rotting just beneath the surface. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching toward us like grasping hands. The silence was deafening, but the crackling of the forest underfoot was all I could hear. And then we found it. A pile of broken branches and leaves. At first glance, it seemed like nothing, just debris that had fallen from the trees. But as we stepped closer, I saw it, a shape buried beneath the mess. At first, I thought it was just more branches, but then I saw something darker, something that shouldn't have been there. A hand, pale, twisted, and not at all human. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Nathan stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. I could hear his shallow breaths, could feel the tension in the air, thickening like a storm cloud ready to burst. That's not real," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling. But it was real. The hand, with its long, gnarled fingers, was unmistakable. It didn't look like anything from this world. There was no logical explanation for it. Without thinking, I reached down, carefully pulling away the branches and leaves. As I did, I uncovered more. A body, half buried, twisted and contorted in a way that no living creature could be. The skin was pale and stretched tight over bones, and there were no eyes, just empty sockets staring up at the sky. I stumbled back, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This was wrong. This wasn't supposed to be here. "We need to go," I muttered, the words barely escaping my lips. My hands were shaking as I backed away, but Nathan didn't move. What is that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking with fear. "But we need to leave. Now." But Nathan didn't seem to hear me. He stepped closer, his eyes glued to the body, like he was trying to make sense of it. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We need to go," I said, my voice louder now, more desperate. "Now, Nathan. We don't have time." His eyes locked with mine, and for a brief moment, I saw the fear in his face, the same fear that was gnawing at my insides. But it wasn't enough to pull him away. He continued staring at the body, mesmerized by it. Suddenly, a noise. A snap of a branch, much louder than before. I whipped my head around. In the distance, Hidden just beyond the trees, there was movement. Someone was there, standing just out of sight. "Nathan," I hissed, pulling him roughly toward me. "We need to go. Now." But Nathan didn't move. He was still transfixed, his gaze fixed on the twisted body on the ground. I turned, my heart pounding. We were no longer alone. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel their presence. It was like they were watching us, waiting for the right moment to step out from the shadows. The forest, once silent and calm, had become alive with sound. The crackling of leaves, the rustling of the branches, and the low, eerie hum of something moving just out of reach. "Nathan," I shouted, shaking him hard now. "Run!" Finally, he snapped out of it, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Without a word, we turned and bolted back toward the trail, our feet slipping on the damp ground as we ran. The sounds of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, followed us, getting closer with every step. Whatever was in the woods with us wasn't human. I could feel it, feel the dread pooling in my chest as I ran faster, pushing myself harder. The crunch of leaves behind us was too close, too fast. I dared not look back. I knew that if I did, it would be the last thing I ever did. We ran through the forest as if our lives depended on it, because, in that moment, I knew they did. My heart hammered in my chest, every breath coming out in ragged gasps. The darkness had enveloped us, the trees pressing in on all sides, leaving us with nothing but the faint path beneath our feet and the sound of our frantic footsteps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing visible, nothing I could pinpoint. But I knew we weren't alone. That feeling from earlier, the one that had started as a whisper in my mind, had become a shrill scream of terror. "Nathan," I shouted, my voice cracking. "We have to make it to the trailhead." "We can't stop." Nathan didn't reply. He was breathing hard, but his eyes were wide with something more than fear. There was a look of realization in his gaze, one that made my stomach drop, like he finally understood the danger we were in. We weren't just running from something we couldn't see. We were running from something alive, something that wanted us. I felt it then, something was close. It wasn't a distant sound or a creak of branches. It was a presence, a pressure. The forest had grown too still. It was waiting, watching. We ran faster, our bodies screaming in protest, but our minds racing with the primal instinct to escape. Every time I tried to focus on the trail ahead, my senses were bombarded with a gnawing certainty that the figures from the shadows were closing in. I heard the crack of twigs, the swish of branches, like something was moving, weaving between the trees, just behind us. I dared to glance back. And that's when it happened. A figure emerged, tall and thin, its form obscured by the thick darkness of the forest, but unmistakable. Its shape was wrong twisted, as if its body had been bent and reshaped in some unnatural way. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, not running like we were, but walking as if it had all the time in the world. I froze. My body locked up with a primal terror I couldn't shake. The thing, whatever it was watching us, its movements fluid, yet wrong. Its skin was ashen, stretched tight over bones that jutted out in grotesque angles. Its face was an empty mask, eyes deep hollows that seemed to swallow the light. It had no mouth, no nose, just an impression of a face, a shape that vaguely resembled a human, but one that had been distorted into something monstrous. I could feel the air around me grow colder, a freezing chill settling over my skin as I stared at the thing. I couldn't look away. It was like I was hypnotized by the emptiness of its gaze, drawn into its abyss. Nathan was beside me, panting, his face contorted with fear, but he had finally caught sight of the creature as well. His hand grabbed mine, tight, as if he needed some form of contact to anchor himself to reality. "So what is that?" Nathan stammered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered back, my throat dry. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation, but the reality of what we were seeing was too much. No logical explanation existed. We weren't looking at a person or an animal or anything we could understand. The creature took a step forward, its long limbs bending in a sickening, unnatural way as it shifted closer. Its movements were too smooth, too perfect, like it had been engineered for this exact purpose. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. Run, I told myself. Run, now. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like my body had decided that I couldn't outrun it, that we were caught, trapped in its gaze. And I knew in that moment that there was no escaping this. Then, another noise. More figures, no. Shapes emerged from the darkness, creeping from behind the trees. They were everywhere. More of them. At least 5, maybe more. Some were still, watching us, their empty faces gleaming like polished bone. Others moved slowly, deliberately flanking us on either side. I could feel the cold sweat pooling on my forehead as my mind scrambled for any sort of plan, any sort of escape. But it was hopeless. The trees surrounded us. The path we had followed was now gone, replaced by an endless expanse of dark wilderness. And the creatures, they were closing in. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We have to run." I looked at him, my eyes pleading, but I saw the same hopelessness reflected in his. He didn't even move. He was too paralyzed, staring at the creatures, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. The thing in front of us, its skeletal frame bending, its limbs creaking like old wood, took another step forward. The air grew heavier. The shadows around us thickened, like they were suffocating the light. I tried to move. I had to move. But something stopped me, an invisible force. It was as if the forest itself was holding me in place, forcing me to watch. Suddenly, the creature's head jerked to the side. Its body followed, and it tilted its head back, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it had no regard for the laws of nature. And then, for the first time, I heard a noise that sent a chill crawling up my spine. A low, guttural hiss, like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then it happened. The creature, if it even was a creature, lunged. It happened so fast, so violently, that I couldn't comprehend it. One moment, it was standing there, watching us, and the next, it was on top of us, its bony fingers reaching for Nathan. "No!" I screamed, throwing myself forward, but the creature was too fast. It had grabbed Nathan, its skeletal hand closing around his arm with unnatural strength. His scream tore through the night, sharp and desperate. I fought, pulling at his arm, trying to drag him away, but the creature's grip was like iron. I could feel its cold, brittle skin scraping against mine, sending waves of nausea through me. The other figures were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on us, their bodies trembling with anticipation. "Nathan!" I screamed again, but my voice was drowned out by the deafening hiss of the creature. It was too much for me to take in, to comprehend. I could feel Nathan's strength waning, his body going limp as the creature's grip tightened. "No!" I shouted again, but it was no use. It was too late. The forest swallowed him whole. And then, everything went silent. The creatures, those twisted, unnatural figures, remained still, watching, as if they were contents now, having claimed what they had come for. Their hollow eyes seemed to absorb the very essence of everything around them, like they were feeding off the fear that had already consumed us. I stood there, frozen in place, my body trembling, unable to process what had just happened. Nathan was gone, vanished into the darkness, swallowed whole by the very thing that had been stalking us from the moment we stepped into the forest. The cold air felt like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me, as I tried to gather my bearings. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. For what felt like an eternity, I remained in that spot, the world around me spinning. The forest, once alive with the sounds of the wilderness, now felt deathly still. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the eerie figures that still lingered in the shadows. But then, something inside me snapped. A small, fragile thread of resolve began to pull at the edges of my mind. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever that was take me too. I had to get out. I had to find a way back. I took one shaky step forward, then another. The creatures didn't move, but I could feel their presence, an omnipresent weight that followed me as I stumbled through the forest, my thoughts fragmented, disconnected from the reality of the world around me. I needed to escape, but I couldn't remember the way. The trailhead was nowhere in sight, the path we had followed now a distant memory. The forest had changed, warped, like it had somehow become a part of the creatures. Every tree, every shadow seemed wrong now, like they were all part of the same twisted illusion. My eyes darted from one dark corner of the woods to the next, searching for any sign of movement, any way out. But all I saw was darkness. Minutes turned to hours, and I had no idea how long I had been walking, stumbling through the forest. My legs ached, and I could feel the weight of exhaustion bearing down on me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't rest. Not with that thing out there. I had to keep moving. Then I heard it. A faint sound in the distance, something that didn't belong in the quiet of the woods. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of twigs breaking. It was distant at first, like an echo of my own thoughts, but it grew louder, closer. I froze, my heart racing again. There was no mistaking it now. Something was coming for me. My body went rigid, and for a moment I thought about running. But the exhaustion had drained me, and I wasn't sure if I could even move fast enough to escape. So I did the only thing I could think of. I found a tree with a thick trunk and pressed myself against it, hiding in the shadows as best as I could. The noise grew louder, and my breath caught in my throat. I dared not move. For a long time, there was nothing. Only the slow, heavy breaths that escaped my lips, and the deafening silence of the forest around me. But the air had changed. It was no longer cold with fear, it was heavy, thick with something else. Something that had begun to suffocate the very life out of this place. And then, just as suddenly as the sounds had started, they stopped. The forest fell silent once more, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was unnerving. The stillness felt like a trap, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I waited. Time lost all meaning. The only thing that mattered now was survival. I had to get out. I had to find a way to leave the forest behind me. And then, without warning, the trees parted. In the distance, I saw a faint light, barely visible through the thick canopy of the woods. The glow of a distant lantern, a promise of something familiar, a sign that there might be a way out. The light flickered, beckoning me like a beacon. It wasn't far, but it felt like the longest journey of my life. My legs screamed in protest as I took one shaky step after another, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. With every step, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if it were allowing me to leave, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to turn around. I didn't dare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the clearing where the light shone brightly. I stopped at the edge, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. And there, in the center of the clearing, I saw a lone figure, standing motionless, holding a lantern. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was watching me. Its presence was both calming and terrifying at the same time. It wasn't one of the creatures, no. This figure was different. It had the shape of a person, but it was too still, too perfect. I wanted to speak, to ask who it was, what it was, but my voice failed me. I felt my legs weaken beneath me, and I stumbled, falling to my knees in the dirt. The figure remained silent, the lantern swinging gently in the breeze. And then, without a word, it turned and began walking away, fading into the trees. I couldn't follow. My body refused to move. The air around me felt too heavy, too oppressive. few years ago, I went on a business trip to a quiet, rural town. I had no idea what awaited me, or how an innocently booked hotel stay would turn into an experience so terrifying it would stay with me forever. It was a mid-October evening when I arrived in this sleepy town, the kind of place you drive through without a second glance. I was on my own for this trip, handling some work that required me to stay overnight. It was a small, charming town, one of those places where everyone knew everyone, and there wasn't much to do besides grab a coffee or walk through the local park. I was staying at a small hotel, something quaint, but nothing fancy. It had been a last-minute booking, as the bigger hotels were all booked out for a nearby convention. The hotel itself wasn't anything extraordinary. It had an old, vintage feel with dark wood panels and a dimly lit lobby. The kind of place that might have been charming in its day, but now just felt a little run down. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a warm smile, greeted me and handed me my room key without much conversation. She didn't seem like the talkative type, and honestly, neither was I. It had been a long drive, and I just wanted to get to my room and unwind. As I walked to my room, I noticed the walls seemed a little thin, and the floors creaked with every step. I couldn't help but feel a slight unease settle in, though I couldn't exactly pinpoint why. I was a person who had spent a lot of time in hotels, and this was just like any other. A little old-fashioned, perhaps, but nothing out of the ordinary. The room itself was small, with an old bed, a tiny desk, and a vintage-style lamp. It had a view of the back parking lot, with just enough light coming from a single street lamp to give the place a quiet, almost eerie atmosphere. I dropped my suitcase on the bed and looked around, taking in the slightly faded wallpaper and the antique furniture. It wasn't unpleasant, but there was something about it that felt off, as if it had been stuck in time for far too long. I shook off the feeling, telling myself that it was just the result of being tired from the drive. After all, I had work to do. I unpacked my bag, settled in with my laptop, and began to focus on the task at hand. Everything seemed fine, almost too quiet. The silence was almost deafening, and I found myself listening to the distant hum of the hotel's old ventilation system more than I would have liked. I ordered dinner from the hotel's restaurant, a small, dimly lit room just down the hall. The food was decent, nothing spectacular, but it hit the spot. I ate alone, not expecting company. After dinner, I retreated to my room. The only company I had was the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak from the hallway. As the night wore on, I started to feel more and more restless. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could point to and say, "That's it." But it was there, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. Eventually, I decided to turn off the lights and get some sleep. I'd have a busy day ahead, and a good night's rest would be necessary. I laid down in bed, my body sinking into the surprisingly soft mattress. The blankets were thick, warm, and heavy, and I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The quiet was comforting in some ways, but in others, it felt oppressive, like it was closing in around me. As I lay there, drifting off, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories this old hotel must have. The ones that weren't in the brochures, the kind of stories that were whispered about by the locals. But I quickly dismissed those thoughts. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. This was just a hotel, a place to sleep and rest before a long day of work. But little did I know, I would soon come to regret that dismissive thought. This was no ordinary hotel, and my stay there would soon take a turn for the terrifying. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I had been lying in bed for what felt like hours, my thoughts drifting in and out of focus. The hum of the old ventilation system was a constant presence in the background, but it didn't help me sleep. There was something about the sound, it wasn't quite consistent. Every now and then, it would falter, a brief pause that would make my mind race. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the old building settling. Then, I heard it. A soft knock. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I had been half asleep after all. But then the knock came again, quiet but distinct. 3 knocks, almost rhythmic, like someone was gently tapping on my door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could that be at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and the hotel was far too quiet for anyone else to be wandering the halls at this time of night. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was 12:15 a.m. The hallway was completely still and no voices, no footsteps, just that persistent, almost melodic tapping. I got up, my feet cold against the old hardwood floor, and walked cautiously to the door. I looked through the peephole, but I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the faint light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows on the walls. I was baffled. Who would be knocking at my door at this time of night, and why didn't they respond when I looked through the peephole? I stood there for a moment, considering whether I should call down to the front desk or just ignore it. But something stopped me. The knocking wasn't normal. It was too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to get my attention. I opened the door just a crack, peering into the hallway. No one was there. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I might have been imagining the whole thing. I stepped out into the hallway, but it felt unnervingly empty. The light from the street lamp outside the window flickered slightly, casting a cold, gray weight over everything. The carpet beneath my feet was soft, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the knocking had stopped. I closed the door behind me and locked it, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. The hallway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. It felt as though I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was in a strange place, and the quiet could easily make you jump at the slightest noise. I climbed back into bed, trying to settle my nerves. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The hum of the ventilation system seemed louder now, almost like a low, distant growl. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had settled over me. For the next hour, I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sounds that might explain the strange knocking. But nothing came. The silence was unnerving. It was the kind of silence that made every little sound seem magnified. The creaking of the building settling, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Nothing unusual, but my mind kept returning to the knocking. It didn't make sense. Finally, just as I was starting to doze off again, I heard a soft scratching sound, like something was gently dragging along the wall. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was coming from the ceiling, or possibly from the floor below me. The sound was slow, almost methodical, like someone or something was dragging something heavy across the floor, just out of sight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening for any further movement. The sound stopped abruptly. I lay there, wide-eyed, listening, my mind racing. Could it have been the building settling again? But it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional, and it felt close. I quickly grabbed my phone from the bedside table and called the front desk. I needed to get to the bottom of this. My hands were trembling as I dialed the number, and it felt like an eternity before someone answered. "Front desk," a voice said, groggy but polite. "Hi, this is room 312. I'm hearing some strange noises. There was knocking on my door earlier, and now I'm hearing something scratching, I think coming from the ceiling or floor. Is everything okay?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the receptionist replied. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. The building's old, so it makes noises sometimes. Maybe it's just the pipes or the wind." I wasn't convinced. "It's more than that." The knocking sounded deliberate, and now this scratching. "It's like something is trying to get in." Another pause. "Sir, I assure you everything is fine. I'll have someone check on it in the morning." But for now, I recommend getting some rest. It's probably nothing. I was about to argue further, but the line went dead. The call had ended, and I was left alone in the room with my racing thoughts. I didn't believe it was nothing. The knocking, the scratching, it all felt too real. My gut told me there was something more to this, something hidden beneath the surface of the hotel's facade. I was in a place that wasn't quite right, and whatever was going on, it wasn't going to let me rest so easily. The next few hours were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little sound made my heart race, and I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. But no one else ever came. The night passed slowly, filled with strange sounds and growing tension. As the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I finally managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. But I knew that the events of the night weren't over. Whatever was haunting that hotel, it wasn't finished with me yet. And I wasn't sure I'd make it through the day without encountering something even worse. Stay tuned, as things are about to take an even darker turn. The next few days were filled with a growing sense of dread that settled in the pit of my stomach, refusing to leave. I had hoped that the strange events I experienced would be isolated incidents, but it became clear that something far more unsettling was at play. I had decided to take a more investigative approach, hoping to get to the bottom of things. After all, it could all be explained away by something as mundane as creaky pipe, faulty wiring, or my overactive imagination. But I knew deep down that I wasn't just imagining it. Whatever was happening at this hotel was real, and it was happening to me. I spent the next couple of days trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. I attended meetings, went to meals, and tried my best to go about my daily routine. But each time I returned to my room, I felt that strange, unshakable tension in the air. It wasn't long before I began to notice more occurrences, small at first, but each one more disturbing than the last. One evening, after a particularly long day, I walked back to my room, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The hotel lobby was eerily quiet, the usual hum of background chatter and clinking of dishes absent. It was as if the place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The bell above the door jingled softly as I walked through, and the receptionist gave me a polite but distracted nod. She was absorbed in something on her phone, hardly looking up as I passed. The silence in the hallways was almost suffocating as I made my way back to room 312. As I approached the door, I froze. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the end of the hall. I blinked, but there was nothing there. I quickly brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. But the feeling of being followed lingered. When I entered the room, I immediately noticed that something was off. The lamp beside the bed was flickering, casting uneven shadows that danced across the walls. The air felt cold, far colder than it should have been, considering the time of year. The thermostat showed a comfortable 72 degrees, but it felt as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. I walked over to the window, half expecting to find it slightly open or a draft coming from the corners, but the seal was intact. Still, the room felt wrong. My senses were heightened. The familiar hum of the ventilation system sounded different, as though it was straining, pushing harder than before. That's when I saw the reflection in the mirror. I don't know how I missed it before, but there, behind me, reflected in the glass, was the faintest outline of a figure standing just inside the doorway. My heart stopped. I whipped around, but no one was there. The door was closed, and the room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of someone being present, watching me from behind. I took a few steps toward the door, my pulse quickening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I opened the door, expecting to find the hallway just as empty as before. But to my shock, the hallway seemed darker. The usual light from the end of the corridor flickered out, leaving only the dim glow from my room to illuminate the way. I stepped out cautiously, my footsteps echoing off the walls. There was no one in sight, but I couldn't help but feel as though I was being followed. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, and the overhead lights flickered, casting strange, jittery shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. I turned a corner, walking past other rooms, but each door felt like it was hiding something. There was an oppressive weight in the air, and as I walked deeper into the hall, I realized I could hear faint whispers. But the strangest thing was that they didn't seem to come from any specific direction. They were everywhere, swirling around me like an invisible force. My breath quickened, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps the old building had some acoustical oddities. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. I continued down the hallway, moving faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached a staircase at the far end of the hall, its wooden banister worn and chipped. The stairs creaked underfoot as I began to descend, but as I reached the bottom, I froze. A low thud echoed from somewhere far above me. Then another, louder. It sounded like something or someone was moving through the rooms above. The noise was accompanied by the same scratching sound I had heard that first night, dragging across the ceiling. It was closer now, more urgent. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I instinctively looked up, but there was nothing to see. I turned around and began to make my way back to the staircase. But something stopped me. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of my vision. I spun around, only to see nothing there. But when I turned back, there it was again, closer now. A dark, elongated figure that seemed to stretch unnaturally, its edges blurry, like a shadow trying to break free from the walls themselves. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled backward. I had to get out of here. I didn't care what was going on, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I rushed back to my room, not bothering to check if anyone was following me. When I closed the door behind me, I locked it immediately, my mind racing. I couldn't stop shaking. What had I just seen? What was going on in this place? The tension was unbearable. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker. The silence was louder than ever, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't understand what was happening or why. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here any longer. But as much as I wanted to leave, something held me back. Something was keeping me here. I stood by the door, staring out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking again. Whatever was haunting this hotel, whatever was following me, wasn't going to let me go so easily. I couldn't explain what was happening to me, to this place. It was like a dream, a nightmare, really, that I couldn't wake up from. And every time I thought I could shake the feeling of dread, it would crawl back, tighter, more insistent than before. The events from the past few days weighed heavily on my mind. The strange noises, the flickering lights, the whispers that didn't belong to anyone. I tried to reason with myself, to dismiss it all as the product of an overworked mind. But every time I tried to relax, something else would happen, pushing me closer to the edge. But nothing had prepared me for what was about to unfold. It was just past midnight when I heard it again, the same scraping sound that had haunted me ever since I arrived. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from inside the room. I sat up in bed, heart racing. The sound was unmistakable, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, slow and deliberate. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it, but my mind couldn't keep up with the terror that shot through me. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing and moving, shifting in ways they shouldn't be able to. I had to check. I had to know what was making that noise. I swung my legs off the bed, my feet touching the cold, hardwood floor. The chill that had settled in the room was unbearable now, and my breath came out in shallow, rapid bursts. I reached for the bedside lamp, flicking the switch, but the light sputtered and died, casting me back into the oppressive darkness. The scraping stopped for a moment, but then it started again. Closer this time. I moved cautiously toward the center of the room, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I had to fight the urge to turn and flee. There was no escaping it, no running away from this place. The noise came again, this time unmistakably near the foot of my bed, like a heavy object sliding across the floor. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and stepped closer, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around. But I couldn't. I had to know. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, the metal feeling icy beneath my fingertips. The door creaked open just a fraction, and in the brief gap, I saw something that stopped my heart cold. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the hallway, backlit by the dim light from the stairwell. At first, I thought it was a person, someone who had gotten lost, maybe a guest who wandered the halls late at night. But the longer I looked, the more I realized that it wasn't a person at all. It was tall, unnaturally tall and thin, like something twisted out of shape. The edges of its form blurred, as though its very presence was a distortion, bending the space around it. Its face, if you could even call it that, was nothing more than a smooth, featureless surface, shiny, like wet marble, except for two deep, black holes where eyes should have been. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away slowly, desperate to shut the door. But as I moved, the figure seemed to shift closer, its long limbs stretching unnaturally toward me. I slammed the door shut with all my strength, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, all was silent. I stood there in the dark, staring at the door, as if it could somehow shield me from whatever was on the other side. My mind raced, and every logical thought I had flew out the window. The figure I saw, whatever it was, couldn't be real, could it? But as I stood there, listening, I could hear the unmistakable sound of dragging once again. It was coming closer. Closer to the door. Closer to me. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a lamp, desperately holding it as a weapon, though I knew it would do little to protect me. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever that thing was reached the door. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and I realized my hands were shaking violently. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my body refused to obey. The dragging stopped. Complete silence. My heart pounded in my chest, every second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. I stared at the door, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, anything. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely a murmur, coming from the other side of the door. "You can't leave." The voice was cold, flat, and it sent a jolt of terror through my body. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed. I couldn't process what I had just heard, couldn't grasp the reality of it. But there was no mistaking it. The voice had spoken directly to me, clear as day, and it was not human. I pressed my back against the wall, holding the lamp tightly, my legs too weak to support me. There was no way out. There was nowhere to go. And that's when I felt it. A hand, cold, icy, and impossibly large. It touched the door from the other side. I could feel it, hear it pressing against the wood, just inches from where I stood. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was lost in the suffocating silence, swallowed whole by the presence on the other side. I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face whatever was waiting for me. The door rattled, and for the briefest moment, I thought it might break open. The metal handle twisted violently, as though something or someone was trying to force its way in. I shut my eyes, unable to look anymore. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against me like a vice. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me with the thing outside. And then, everything went still. The silence that followed the violent rattling of the door was the kind of silence that felt like it was smothering me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes. Every part of me was frozen in place, held captive by fear. I knew I couldn't stay in the room any longer. If I did, whatever was out there would find a way in. My heart was still racing, each beat reverberating in my chest, too loud, too fast. The lamp I was holding felt like a feeble defense against something so monstrous and otherworldly. And then, in the deepest part of the silence, I heard it again. The dragging sound. But this time, it was no longer distant. It was right outside the door. Closer. Every scraping, every slow movement felt like it was a breath away from breaking through the barrier. The door rattled again. I couldn't stand it any longer. With a burst of adrenaline, I sprang into action, my body almost moving before my mind could catch up. I rushed to the window, my eyes scanning the darkness outside for any sign of safety, any sign of escape. The window was old, its hinges rusted, but with desperate hands, I managed to force it open just enough to squeeze through. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but there was no time to feel the chill. I climbed out, slipping as my feet found no purchase on the slick ledge beneath me. I didn't care. I had to get away. I didn't even glance back at the hotel, at the room, at the door. I simply ran. The yard stretched before me, the trees looming like dark sentinels, and I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the sharp sting of branches against my skin, ignoring the fear that made my chest tighten with every step. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling from the cold and the sheer terror I had just escaped. The only sound now was the steady hum of passing cars in the distance, the normality of it almost jarring after the nightmare I had just lived through. I stumbled to the side of the road, looking up at the dimly lit sign of the nearest town just a few miles down. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back to that hotel, to that place that had seemed so innocuous just days before. But as I stood there, my feet frozen in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fear that had gripped me in the hotel hadn't dissipated. In fact, it had only grown stronger now that I was away from the immediate danger. I had escaped the hotel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been there, whatever had haunted that place, was still with me. I turned back to look at the hotel one last time, the building dark and looming in the distance. The lights inside had gone out, the windows now pitch black. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the end of it.